This is a signal moment for me, an opportunity to appear before you and give my testimony. I've worked with most of you, and I'm happy to see the next generation of prophetic leaders on the panel, and we're asking that would happen. But I grew up in a segregated society. I lived in a segregated community, attended a black church. I never had a white classmate until I was in college. I lived 100 yards from the major walking pool, they called it then, where the fountain would send water up 25 feet in the air, would fall down, and the children would run under that falling water, laughing and having fun. But as an African-American child, I couldn't go in that park. That was the Winchester Park, Brother Bill, that Elvis Presley frequented many times. Then there was another park. When we would go to the hospital, John Gaston, the Forest Park was another wading pool. That's the name, a wading pool. We couldn't go in that park.
Teach them.
And Mama would always say, boy, the day will come when you can. But there was a woman next door who had been financially blessed, Mrs. Cleo Dickens. She went somewhere and bought a little clown, and he had a water hose in his hand, and the pressure of the water hose would make him do this. And we would run and get under that water while the white children were in the wading pool. Grant School was located at 6th and Auction. And one day Mr. R.B. Thompson got on the internet and said, boys and girls, one day you will go to school with little white children. And there was a spontaneous burst of laughter. We couldn't imagine going to school with white children. Well, Ben Hooks, Pastor Ben Hooks, I was nurtured under him, and I saw him involved in the civil rights movement. I saw him, news reports, my mother would say, pray for your pastor, boy, pray for your pastors. Yes, ma'am. He was shot at one night coming out of Fayette County. Fayette County was a mean county. Tent City, Dr. Forbes, Tent City. The plantation owners gathered their crops that year and then evicted the tenant farmers, and they were out of doors. But the National Baptist Convention went to Fayette County and bought 100 acres of land and erected tents. And it was Dr. Coleman who said they had more dignity in those tents than they did in those tenant houses. A mean crucible. When I enrolled at Lane College in 1964, I met many of those students. Gina, you know Miles Wilson. Miles Wilson came out of the Tent City experience and became the superintendent of the Fayette County schools. Somebody ought to say, God is good. Also, he served as a county commissioner. But I'm saying that the crucible of our experiences do wonderful things for our resolve and core values. Those students from Fayette County, they were no-nonsense students. They were for real. My first experience at Lane in terms of political activity was a big rally to re-elect Lyndon B. Johnson. Got on back campus, there was a guy named Steele Grimes who was leading the rally with a big 10-gallon Texas cowboy hat on. I said, now who is this clown? But what he was doing, he was symbolizing the candidate we were working for was LBJ, because the LBJ had just passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And we went into the communities asking people to register and to vote. And that was my introduction to actively being involved. And I've been involved ever since. In 1968, as a senior, I was driving back and forth with a chaplain from Western State Psychiatric Hospital. We were trying to raise monies to build a chapel on the campus of the Western State Hospital. So Mr. Theus, who was the leader, said, "Do you know the Negro councilman who just got elected?" I said, "Yeah, I know them." He said, "Can you take me down and we meet him?" I said, "Sure." We came down to meet Joe Patterson Jr., Fred Davis, and Jim Nettis. And walking through the corridors of City Hall, you could feel the tension, and they were moving, trying to get this done. And Bill, you were in the middle of all of that. And so Jim Nettis was optimistic. Jim Nettis said, "I think we can end this without a strike." But the strike did come, and I started to drive back and forth on weekends. I had my best friends at Lemoyne College, and they would keep me posted on what was happening, what was going on. So I'd come back and forth and march. Several marches were without Dr. King, meeting and rallies, and then Dr. King was asked to come in because seemingly nothing could break this man's resolve. He was going to keep his Negroes in place in Memphis. But when the labor union stood with these men, you had the coming together of civil rights and labor. Powerful link that we must not ever forget. And in that crucible, Dr. King was killed, and I remember the night we marched out of student government meeting into chapel, and Arthur David was trying to console us and have us to get ready. But as I sat in that chapel that night, the words of Pastor Hooks came back to me as clear as day. Either you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I chose that night that I was going to be a part of the solution. So I continued in that work back and forth. The next march, Rabiel, was that silent march we were supposed to have. Mrs. King led that march. And in the orientation in the church, they had all these talks about, well, y'all be careful, because don't do anything crazy, because they're looking for some of you to do something crazy so they can shoot and kill you. There will be snipers on every building, and there were. When we got on Main Street, you could see the sharpshooters on every building. But that was one day I didn't give a flying flip. I said, this is in honor of Dr. King, and we're going to carry this march out peacefully, and we're going to do it. We got to City Hall, and we heard Mrs. Coretta Scott King, who asked us to commit to working for the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. Well, later on, I came back to Memphis in 1973 at the University of Tennessee's medical school to do some work. And I joined the sickle cell anemia movement. And it was there that I got involved with NAACP, National Urban League, and then later on joined PUSH. And I served in the PUSH organization from 1973 up until 2015 when I stepped down as the president. But in that move, one of the key things we did in Memphis, we elected the first black school superintendent by saying to the school board that had the majority that we're not going to accept an outside white man when you have an African American sitting right under the superintendent who has been prepared to be the superintendent. So we said to them, heavens no. Well, Mr. Coach got the message and wrote a letter back that he would not accept. He would withdraw from being considered. That's Dr. Willie Harrington. And then fighting for the school board, we discovered every vote we lost was 10-3. You had 10 whites and 3 African Americans on the school board. We lost every vote 10-3. So Ernie Jackson of the WDIA called me and said, Brother Gray, if you organize the march, I'll give you all the airtime you want. I said, we don't need to march. We need to go to court. He said, what would we do in court? I said, we would challenge the one man, one vote theory in the Voting Rights Act. He said, you think we can win it? I said, absolutely. No one's ever tried it before. He said, if you do that, you file the lawsuit, I'll fund it. I said, okay, let's go to work. And Gina, Dr. Stewart, we found the very man who had lost 3 times, W. Otis Higgs, had lost 3 times because of the runoff. He could win the general, but he lost the runoff because we didn't do proper voter education. Did you vote for WOC? I voted, baby. I voted for him the first time, but that was the second time you're supposed to vote. She said, no, I voted for him. They did not know that the runoff was more important than the first vote.
Right.
We lost 3 times. So I said, here's what we need to do. We need to challenge this runoff. And we went to court, and all hell broke loose for those of us who filed that lawsuit. It was 7 of us on that lawsuit. They charged me with mismanagement of public funds and one thing and another. And I had to live with embarrassment for 7 months until the audit was done. And when the audit was done and the rendering of it, they put in a little bitty section of the paper.
Of course.
That all funds accounted for in the Sickle Cell Anemia Council's in good financial standing. I wanted to cuss. Then the judge, the federal judge, he was a redhead Republican judge. And I said that because that's how I remembered him. But he ruled without a trial that the runoff was unconstitutional. And W.W. Harrington was elected the first black mayor of Memphis. But not only was he elected, you had a majority on the city council, a majority on the school board, and we had control politically, we thought, of the city of Memphis. Now it has also resulted that we have a majority on the county commission. Billy Kyle said the mistake we made was we applauded them and celebrated them, but we went home and the special interests corralled them. While we were celebrating, they were organizing and they were strategizing. Who would be his chief of staff? Who would work under him? Who would handle the contracts for the city? The power structure is not in office. It's the power behind the throne. And we had to learn that. So my point in terms of our needs and where we need to go is we got to combine our education of our young people in terms of activism, that the political power is of no value until it's transformed into economic power.
Yes.
If the grants and the monies keep flowing the same direction and you got all these people in office, it doesn't make any difference. And that's why many of our people don't vote. Still got potholes in my neighborhood. Garbage still is picked up last in our neighborhood. And we're talking about all this power we got. So it's hard to motivate them when they keep seeing that we have trouble. Now, let me quickly close. I see the sign over there about to come up, but I want to suggest that we have some unfinished business.
We do.
I think my beloved sister here is a psychologist. We had casualties of the movement.
Okay. That's right.
Come on.
I mean, serious casualties.
Help us.
We honored the Memphis 13. These were 6-year-old children
My Lord.
who walked through the doors of segregated schools.
My Lord.
The civil rights leaders at that time, Billy Cowles and A.W. Willis, and they got some other people to sacrifice their children.
Yes.
And those children are traumatized to this day.
My Lord.
When we gave them their markers, some of them wept. We thought we had been forgotten. And then they told us about the pain of walking through those doors.
My Lord.
Yeah.
My Lord.
And mama and daddy would turn and go back home.
My Lord.
And they were left alone. My dear friend James Meredith was a casualty for a long time.
Yes, he was.
Thank God he recovered. But to go through what James Meredith went through,
My Lord.
and to still be standing
My Jesus.
is an act of God. So I'm suggesting that we need to organize a panel of black psychologists to go in to meet these people who have come through the crucible and who have been wounded and who are being permanently damaged. If they had gone to Vietnam, they would have gotten some treatment. They went through sometimes worse than Vietnam. And we have ignored them. We have forgotten them. The next bit of business I want to talk about is if the one man, one vote theory is to be a reality, we need to test it. We didn't lose this last election.
That's right.
Hillary won that election, but the Electoral College
That's right.
decided to go with Mr. Trump.
Right.
Now, go back historically. That system was put in place to make sure they control the balance of power.
That's right.
But everybody that voted in 2016, their rights were violated when the Electoral College elected Mr. 45. I don't want to call his name. That's the unfinished business, brothers and sisters, that we have got to deal with. The other thing is, in slavery, our children were auctioned off without any option.
My Lord.
But in my opinion, we auction them off now every day. Charter schools, vouchers, and the greed of corporate America
That's it.
has extended her tentacles into every part of our community.
That's right.
And our children are being auctioned off one by one. One said, well, we get vouchers, our children go to better schools. They're not going to be able to go to better schools.
That's right.
Who controls admission at those schools? They do.
That's right.
And who's going to bridge the gap between the voucher and the actual cost? In Memphis, some of these schools cost $30,000 a year. The voucher was only for $7,000.
My.
Lab fees and field trips that are mandatory. Who's going to pay for all of that?
Right.
But what will happen, and this is great, the minute you get vouchers for these, quote, black children in the inner city of Memphis, Tennessee, some white family in Chattanooga is going to file a lawsuit of discrimination, and then you'll get vouchers for everybody, and that'll be the ruination of public education.
That's right.
That's a reality, brothers and sisters, and we need to address that. Because until the masses of us are lifted out of ignorance
Say that.
and uninformed, none of us will ever get anywhere. And I'm committed. I told Dr. Proctor I had the great pleasure of being his chauffeur for a week in Jackson, Tennessee. And if you've been around him, you just take in, you just absorb all of this man's wisdom and commitment. But the thing that struck me most was his compassion for what he was doing. He said when he heard of Dr. King's death, he was in a cab going to do a workshop to teach white folk how to teach black children. He said the cab driver turned to him and said, "Did you hear that Dr. King has been killed?" And Dr. Proctor said his first reaction was, "Why would this guy be the one to tell me?" Tobacco juice on his shirt, unclean, uncouth. And he said, "Why would this guy be the one to tell me?" And then he said when that man got through telling him, he started shaking him and began to cry. And Dr. Proctor said he had to repent because it then was revealed to him that passion and sensitivity know no color. So we got to work across the divide to save our people. 50 years later, here we are.
All right.
I learned that from Bill Lucy. And trying to pass it on to Earl Fisher. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, man.
So I think that's a wonderful opportunity for me to say what I think needs to be put on record to prayerfully dispel some of the misnomers that seem to be perpetuated far too far and far too often. And so I just want to express, as I try my best to hold back the tears,
Bless you, man.
the depth of the gratitude that the emerging leaders of the legacy that you all helped to sustain, how grateful we are for your contributions, your sacrifices, and also that y'all trust us enough to carry the mantle. So that everybody would know that there is no rift, but that there is a continuum in this freedom movement, and that we recognize and acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of giants like yourself.
Bless you, man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I won't let Earl have that moment alone. The whole time I was texting, "That's what we're saying." And there's just so much here that I feel like all day, everything that we've heard, if we close our eyes, you just call it 2018. And we had the conversation over lunch, pretty much how did we not have this conversation in 2058? 68, damn it. Excuse me. 2068.
68.
And I just, I wanted to say that as someone who's interested in politics myself, clearly, it sits with me. The political power has no value until it turns into economic value. And as we're facing critical election years of 18, 19, 20 here at home in Memphis and nationally, but local politics is where our focus definitely needs to lie. And while we are having heightened conversations about voter turnout and engagement, it's not trickling down. Like you said, the apathy is not dispelling in the people we want to get to the polls. So to us, we're all fired up, and we're at these tables, and we're on Twitter, and we're in these rooms, but the same folks who we need to get out to vote, it's not getting down, right? And so how do we get this value at a time when our whole county could turn color by 2020 will be a mostly Republican county if we don't get the message out that this is one of the most critical 3 years of elections in our city. And then, Dr. Gray, how do we hold the people who are using this momentum to run for office accountable? That if you step up and ask for the Black community's endorsement, that you're going to make sure we're not having these conversations in 50 years.
Yes. I think it's part of education. And let us commend Ms. Sawyer for her fight to remove these Confederate statues in Memphis. Ms. Sawyer, you didn't let that fight die. In 2005, we started that fight. We brought in Al Sharpton, and the Klan came to town from Kentucky, Missouri, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi. The Klan came to town. So the sheriff called me that night before and said, Mr. Gray, there will be an unmarked car in your driveway because you have been targeted. You and De'Army Bailey and Walter Bailey and Dwight Montgomery, you've been targeted, and we will be protecting you. The next day when we got to the park, they had surrounded the park in their trucks. And they were just angry, mean, ready to fight. And so, Sister Sawyer, that same fervor that you used to do what you did in picking that fight up and achieving that, voter education and registration, and teaching our young people the connection between the vote and the dollar. That's what we got to learn. I was against the merge of our schools. I heard that mentioned earlier. Because we had control of $1 billion. $1 billion a year we had control of, and they gave it up because of misinformed 2 young leaders. We gave up $1 billion to get a school system now that is in demise because the very people they thought they had to bring in left. And so we got to teach that, Tammy, the connection between the ballot and the dollar. And I think we can make it. The other thing, we got to hold our elected officials accountable.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
All we got to do is not vote for one, send one out of office, and that message will go very clearly that they ain't playing. But we put them back in office every day. They can act a fool on the council, do anything they want to do on the county commission. We put them right back in office every time. But if we stop doing that, they'll get the message.
That's right.
And then we can get some respect. Dr. Forbes.
Man, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want you to speak to the issue of why it was that your recommendation that we challenge in the court the relationship between the general election and the runoff. So it felt like that must have been a stroke of genius, especially given the results that came from it. But what I want to talk about is what was it that pushed you or that informed you or that inspired you to see that action and to take it? You see, because a lot of things that are impossible, we don't even think about them.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden somebody says, no, that's possible. What was the source of your impulse of the possibility? That's what I want you to mention. Because we're going to need some, most of what we're going to work for is impossible. You can't do it. Ain't nothing can be done about it. So I'm interested in, where does the breakthrough to the impulse to possible, where did that come from in you?
I guess the pain of, is this mic on?
Yes, it is.
The pain of disappointment. When I woke up the morning after and they said Mr. 45 was president, unbelievable. But the whole thing of it is that nothing happens unless we feel the pain of where we are. And that's when we get real. The goal is not beautiful in the crucible. It has to come out of the crucible. And so I think what Mr. 45 is presenting to us is a crucible that we will have no options but to take on the Electoral College. It's unconstitutional, and we need to take it on. If you give us the one man, one vote theory, that's very clear in the Voting Rights Act, then we need to challenge it to get rid of the Electoral College. And I would hope that in fact, I gave this speech at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference last summer, and they picked up on it. And Ms. Attorney Barbara Unwine is leading a group now to start moving. Just left Detroit.
They just left Detroit last week.
To move on that, Dr. Forbes, that we need to systematically go around the country, educating and training, and that's what Attorney Unwine is doing. She's training people to fight this fight.
That's right.
Because one of the problems with our young people in millennial fight, Brother Fisher, Dr. Johnson, is that we didn't sit down and train these young folk.
Right.
That march that erupted with all of the violence with Dr. King, Brother Bill, Dr. King's big disappointment was that he found out later that they had not trained the marshals for those marches. And so we got to train young people to think about this fight. Now, you can't be a coward and fight this fight.
Listen.
Oh,
No, you can't be a coward
tell us.
and fight this fight. You got to be resolved that come hell or high water, I'm going to stick with this commission for voting justice.
That's it.
I think that's what Attorney Unwine calls it. So, Doc, I think it's the pain of that causes us to act on most of the things that we do. Yes, sir.
I'm thinking about what I just heard. Good Reverend here was talking about campaign finance, about how many of our elections, I think in 2016, 25 people gave $600 million for the 2016 elections. And that's the power, and we can imagine who these people are, right? And what their values are. I'm thinking a lot about money and about how we kind of shift the power dynamics and how we shift who actually has the power to control our elections and control our campaigns. I'm curious to know a little bit about like how you think about like money in politics. How do you think about what are the things that are in the way for folks to really engage in the political process? Another thing I would say is that I've been doing a lot of work in St. Louis, Missouri, where folks are talking about not wanting to vote, and they're talking about not wanting to vote because they can point to what their voting has done and the destruction that they have seen and the people that they've actually wanted and they voted in hopes that these folks would actually do something powerful for their community, but haven't done anything and have like actually harmed their community. So I feel like there's a complicated question. I'm curious
it's a good
about
question.
how you think about money. How do you think about like what does that political education process look like? And then I think thirdly, and then I'll stop, is like how do we, the thing that I'm really moved by you and by other folks that have talked is that folks who have come from the community are the ones who are like moving the community. And so many times we have politicians who actually don't come from the community, or their self-interest is actually not because they love black folks. They don't love the community that they're in. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Well, I have a philosophy. Number one, no politician anywhere can ever say they gave Lysimba some money. If I support a candidate, the first thing I do is write a check, if I'm in support of that candidate. And so I say to the brothers and sisters who are in the camp to support, write a check. Why you do that? Great. Why I do that? Because when I call, I want them to answer the phone. Number one, then you're not, he didn't buy you. You are empowering your political servant, your civic servant. So I say that number one. But we know the money comes. And we need to talk to the leaders, the politicians when they are in office and say that this is going to happen, but we want you, the number one, we need to give them an agenda. That's what we need to do. Give them an agenda on the front end. And this is how you will be measured, that you implement this agenda. And, but don't let no politician buy you. Don't let them buy us.
Great.
Dr. Lysimba, we are so
Dr. Gina.
grateful for your wisdom and your courage, and I am just so thankful that I know you and that God has kept you alive to share with us
50 years,
today.
thank you.
We thank you for sharing your testimony, but as usual, we must continue and move on to the next presenter.
Yes.
Thank you so much
It's been my honor.
for coming.
I'd like to welcome Gail Tyree, who is the former Assistant Director and Executive Director of the Ask Me Local 1733.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, I feel so special. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I want y'all to know that this huge panel was just a little bit intimidating when I first got here, but I've had some conversations with some people in the audience, and I'm grateful to be able to share my story. I'm Gail Tyree. I'm a native Floridian, a mother of 3, and used to be the former, of course, executive director and the assistant director of Ask Me Local 1733. I walked in those footsteps behind some pretty big feet. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to introduce the first black female executive director of Ask Me 1733, Dorothy Crook, who's in the audience, and I could not do it. When I went to do it, I started to cry. She said, "We'll sit down. I'll introduce myself." And I have to say all of that to say that it's an honor just to serve this Memphis community. I can remember as a teenager, I'm one of 5 children. My mom was a single mom. We lived in a poor community. Everybody in my community looked like me. And I can remember my mother telling us she was a laundry worker with a 10th grade education. And I can remember my mom would always say, "Get a union job." She would always say, "Get a union job," but she never told us what a union job was. And so I would get the newspaper, and I would look through the newspaper for jobs that said union jobs.
Well,
Never saw one. My sister, who is, I'm the middle child. There's a brother and a sister over me, and I have 2 sisters under me. And my oldest sister, she went to work for the telephone company. And when she came home, she said, "I got a union job." And my desire was to get a union job. And I did. I landed a job when I was in my early 20s for the telephone company. And I was so happy. And it was right before the telephone company was getting ready to go out on strike. I was the only black female that worked in this particular location. There were 3 older white women that I worked with. And it was about, I guess I'd only been on the job just a few days, and they said, "We're getting ready to go out on strike." And I told them, "Y'all go right ahead, because I need to pay my car note, and I need to give my mama some money, so y'all can do anything y'all want to do, because I'm coming to work." And these 3 older women say, "We just gonna tell you like this, sweetie. You cross this line if you want to. So, of course, when they went out on strike, I was walking with my sign because I felt like I could take out 2 of them, but I didn't think I could take out that 3rd. She looked like she was a little rough. But when I went back to work, those 3 young ladies told me, say, look, you're young. You're going to be here when we're gone. So we're going to make you the union steward. You're going to be the one that's going to represent us on this job. And that started me down the road that I'm currently on. I was scared to death. And like the Bible said, they trained me up in the way I should go. I moved through the ranks. I became a union steward. I moved on up and became eventually the vice president of my local. Went to work for the AFL-CIO and became an international rep, and have worked for several unions, organizing, married a union man, raised my children with union dollars, and my daughter is the first one in my family to graduate with a master's degree on union money. A couple of years ago, she, right before she got a bachelor's, she said she was gonna quit school. Well, when I was growing up, my mom, her hope for us was to make it out of high school. Just get a high school diploma and get you a good union job. And my goal for my daughter was to do better than me, the same way my mom wanted me to do better than her. And so when my daughter decided she was gonna run off with her boyfriend to the military and she wasn't gonna finish her degree, I said, you can't do it, you can't quit. She said, Mama, you did. I said, you're right. I said, you know, I have to be a person that is an example for not only for my daughter, but for other daughters that's coming behind me. And so I went back to school, and I told her, I said, I'm gonna go long as you go. I hope she don't get a doctor's degree. When I moved to Memphis 17 years ago, 18 years ago almost, the very first stop we made was in front of AFSCME Local 1733. And I told my children, I say, you're sitting in front of history. I said, when they open this building, I have to take you inside of this place. I said, and one day, your mama, I'm gonna work here. Speaking truth to power.
Yes.
I said, I'm gonna go to work in this place because I have to be a part of this history. Unbeknown to me at the time, it took me a couple of years, but I made it. And I became the assistant director, quitting a job, making more to be in that place. Coming up behind me are young people that we say all the time, they don't get it, they don't understand, they don't know the sacrifices. Well, I'm telling you this, some of it I blame on us. Because we have to start at our own kitchen tables. At 16, I had no idea what a union was. And my mom, she could not articulate to me what it was. But she said, get a union job. Well, now I can. I can articulate what a union is and what labor does for us. And how a little poor black nappy-head girl from Jacksonville, Florida, have traveled the world on a union dime. I can tell my daughter that if you're on a job and somebody is not being treated right, it is your place to say something. It is your place. It's your place to say it on your job. It's your place to stand up for people in this world, in your city, in your town, in your community. And I can remember my mama having a conversation with one of my bosses one day. They came to the house. We were doing some organizing around private prisons, trying to stop the growth and expansion of private prisons. And he asked my mom, he said, where does Gail get the passion to do this work? I was eavesdropping, they wasn't talking to me. And I was just had my head kind of around the corner because I wanted to hear what they were going to say about me. And she looked at me and she said, believe it or not, she was born that way. She was the one that took up for bullies before there was ever even a name. She was the one that took the children off the playground and would take the ones that nobody would pick on their team and always put them on her team. She said, I would look out the window and I would see that they were going to lose, and I'd say every day, they're going to lose. And they did, but they still had a good time. And that's the thing that I want to make sure that I'm passing along to my children and my grandchildren, is to stand up for others. Take on something sometime bigger than yourself. And you know, your parents and your grandparents always ask, if not you, then who? And so it's me. I believe in the union. I believe in what labor does for all of us, because I'm telling you, without the labor unions, I would have never traveled some of the places I've traveled and been in some of the fights I've been in and seen some of the things I've seen and have the story that I have. I've been here in Memphis 17 years, and I've spent a whole lot of time with all the labor unions here in the city, and I currently serve as a labor liaison for the AFL-CIO Central Labor Council with United Way, who y'all will hear from later today, Dr. Kenneth Robinson. And when somebody asked me, Gail, really, what do you do? I said, I'm working right now, still as an organizer, moving the needle on poverty. I'm a fundraiser and an activist and an organizer.
Go ahead.
Still working for the people of this community.
Go ahead.
I don't have to tell y'all the numbers because I know you already know them. When we're in a community with 45% of adults, our children actually living in poverty, and 25%, over 25% of adults. And my mom was poor, and it had nothing to do with her being lazy. And I hate to even think of anybody that would say poor people are lazy and they don't want to work. Because my mom was not poor. My mom was not lazy. I grew up poor, and I'm definitely not lazy. It's just a lack of resources. And that's what we have to fight for. We have to fight to make sure that the resources are distributed equally. And the one thing that I've learned on this road, and I know I read it somewhere, that the oppressor is not going to give the oppressed anything. And that the only way you're going to get it is you're going to have to get out and fight for it. And the old union cliche is divided, see, I'm going to get it wrong. United we fall. United we stand, divided we fall has now changed as united we stand, divided we beg.
Wow.
I'm not a beggar, I'm a fighter.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful for the labor rights that I have on the back of people like Bill Lucy, Mr. Bill Lucy. And the doors that was kicked open for me by Ms. Dorothy Crook.
That's right.
Because I know nobody opened them and told her, just come on in. And there's so many in this city that have fought. Our sanitation workers, I went this morning to the reef land, and I was choked up at the men that are still working.
My Lord.
And I think in closing, I have to say, when people always say, well, what's the difference in now and then? You know the old saying, some things change while everything stays the same.
Well,
We're still fighting for some of the same things. We're still fighting to get in some of the same doors. We're still jumping to try to reach some of the same glass ceilings. But we can never grow tired.
That's right.
We have to keep doing it. Because there was people that did not give up on me. And I'm not giving up on those that's coming behind me. And even if they have to sometime hold my hand to push that ceiling, I'm going to push till the last breath in me is gone. Because so many went before me, did the very same thing. I'm proud of the people that have come before me in labor, that have made the pathway for me to fight. And my job is to sit to as many kitchen tables as I can and educate our young people on this struggle. I can remember a day when I used to sign my signature. You know, people always say I'm in the struggle. My signature would be, I'm a sister in the solution. That's who I am. Thank y'all so much.
Bill, you want to start? Bill, you want to start?
Let me thank Ms. Tyree for that powerful presentation and testimony. Let me raise with you and ask you to sort of comment on. And Memphis is almost typical of our conditions in a lot of places. Do you think that our community understands the role that labor plays in the quality of life of folks in that community? And I raise it to see whether or not you believe that there is a pro-labor attitude among the majority of people who live in our community.
I think...
And I got a follow-up question.
Okay. Mr. Lucy, I think they understand. I think what the problem is, I think that there is just a lack of passion. I think there's a feeling of being defeated. And I know they understand, because when I stand with the young people that are in the fight for 15, they understand. They understand. But there are times when they really do feel like they're almost defeated before they get started. When you think about things like policy where we can't peacefully assemble, or when you think about the policy right now where AFSCME is getting ready to face the Supreme Court, where they're cutting off the head of how we fund labor rights, how we fund the labor fight. You know, it's always said, take the money away, you take away the fight.
Let me ask a good question. Do our folks look to our church as an ally in that struggle?
No.
Yeah.
I do. I got a good pastor.
Say their name. Say their name.
But overall, no. And I think that the church should be a place where labor rights are taught.
Yep.
You have a captive audience when you're sitting in church. And two things as adults that we will do, 9 out of 10 times, I'm going to do what my mama say, and I'm going to do what the preacher say. And so if it's going to be taught anywhere, we have a church on every corner. But first, we have to change the mindset of the pastor that's bringing the message.
Come on.
Oh, Lord.
Go ahead.
You opened up an interesting question. Does your pastor relate tithing to the ability to tithe?
Say that again.
Does he or she relate tithing? Because the quality of our church life, our community life, our home life is based on our ability to underwrite that economically. So if we are earning more money, we can give more money. And I'm not suggesting that ought to be the criteria, but it's the reality. And our fight for workers' rights has to be centered on how it impacts our economic life. And I think every history you look at will show you that workers who are unionized earn better wages, better benefits, and their family and community life is better as a result of that. So I guess
I'll pass it to Sister Gail. I'll just simply first quote my fraternity brother and freedom fighter, Reverend Dr. Barber, who said, "For us to ask our members to tithe, but not be on the front line advocating for them to have a livable wage, is pastoral malpractice."
That's right.
And that's true.
Right.
And I think Sister Gail can tell you about what she's heard me say, and not just do, but since we're just talking about pastors in terms of what she's heard me say on Sundays from the pulpit with regards to economic justice and livable wages.
And let me also say this, Mr. Lucy. I'm at Abyssinia Missionary Baptist Church because of not one word that my pastor said to me about Jesus. I'm smart enough to read the Bible for myself.
All right.
I spent 18 years in the Church of Christ, 18 years in the Presbyterian Church, and 21, I'm telling my age. Okay, okay, I know Jesus. But I'm in Abyssinia Missionary Baptist Church because of what I see my pastor do in this community and around social justice issues. I need him to tell me what Jesus would do in these situations I'm living in every day. I don't need you to tell me to pray. I need to know that when I stand on the front line with people that are struggling and trying to decide if they're going to eat or buy medicine, I need to know you're going to stand with me.
That's right.
That's what I need. I don't need you to tell me what Jesus said. I can read.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask a question. Can I say something behind that, though? You got a question, though, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I want to know, since you work with the Central Labor Council here, do they appreciate this strike? I was very surprised when Lee Saunders, the head of AFSCME, made the motion at the AFL-CIO convention to establish IM 2018, when the firefighters from Memphis stood up to say they didn't have a union. They didn't have a union when the sanitation workers went out. It was eye-opening to them, and they organized only because they had seen these black men organize. Does the CLC give the respect to this local, because the rest of them, to be honest, weren't doing nothing themselves? This strike was more earth-shattering for the labor movement. We are concentrating on it from a black perspective, but for the labor movement, this strike broke big barriers. Do they appreciate that contribution?
They do. They do. And let me say this, when you say the Central Labor Council, now the Central Labor Council is made up of all of the unions here in this city. So to say that they don't appreciate it would say that none of us as union members appreciate it, when I know we all do. The one thing I will share with you is that here locally, we struggle because the position of the Central Labor Council president is a non-paid position. The president, Mr. Irvin Calise, works a full-time job as an international rep for the United Steelworkers. So 9 to 9 at night, he's negotiating contracts. He's out there on the front line. He's fighting for his workers. And so he's doing a whole lot of other things. So it's hard to do everything when you're already doing everything. And I guess the question I would ask is that, how much respect do the firefighters have for the Central Labor Council?
Brother Bill has already kind of addressed my first question. I was going to talk about how can we get more people involved in unions and knowing that labor, and you brought up the theological questions and stuff like this. So I ask this real quick because we got 2 minutes. There seems to be a privileging of certain unions. How do we get out of the box where the police unions, for instance, are loved and respected, and just, fire unions maybe too in certain cities and places, and other unions are looked at as you fill in the blank, and it seeps into the community, and that's what you were getting at, Brother Bill, about, do we even now appreciate the role of unionized labor and labor, period? So can you speak a little bit in the time remaining about how can we get away from privileging or looking at one union as like good and other unions like bad?
Reverend Johnson, I believe that's a trick question. Because I know you already know the answer. But for the sake of the rest of the panel, I guess I will.
Talk about leading.
Well, let me just say this. I was riding down the street the other day, and I was thinking that very same thing. I was thinking about how some unions are looked at from a different perspective just because of the services they offer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But you think back to 1968, and the sanitation workers proved that picking up garbage is an essential service.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And we just need to let the powers that be realize that it's an essential service. Because if for some reason we stop picking up trash, I promise you the fire department and the police is not going to go out there and pick it up.
Mm-mm.
If we stop mowing the grass in these parks, they're not going to do it. But the one thing I will share with you, if you don't already know it, 2015 through the first quarter of 2016, the AFL-CIO convened their own commission on racial and economic justice. Yeah, I read the whole report. And yeah, I can read as unions, and I'm specifically talking about fire, police, and some of our bigger unions. We have to mirror the people that we represent.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we have to have more diversity in the leadership of our union, the same way we have to have more diversity in the leadership of our legislators.
All right.
And I think some of that, as we begin to move up and get in these positions, I'm talking African Americans, take the leadership role, take your place. And not saying that the union leadership are the oppressor, but if you want to see things change, you have to make sure that you're willing to work for the change. Mm-hmm. And so we really do need to take on some of those leadership roles, and I think that would definitely make the difference. And we can't wait for the change, we have to make the change. Mm-hmm.
Can I make one final observation as we get ready to transition? And it deals with this question here. The challenge for our community, given the historical record of participation by police, is try and find a way where decent police can get representation if they have to from their employer. Not police work for the city.
Right.
When it comes down to a charge of police misconduct, and particularly in the case of homicides by police, the city ought to represent their employees, as opposed to the police union getting engaged in what essentially is a homicide charge. Now, I am absolutely positive if you get into a situation where the city has to defend the actions of its employee, you're going to start getting a different political result and perspective on police misbehavior. Now the question becomes making the broad community pay for this. Since the broad community never thinks there's anything done wrong by police, let them start financing some police actions out of their tax dollars. And they will find out how many millions of dollars are paid out as a result of police misconduct. That's not to suggest that every police is wrong, because we need protection more than anybody you can think of. We really need some protection. But a substantial amount of it, we need protection from them. And we ought to have a discussion. I don't know what the answer is, but the answer is not the police union inserting itself in between police misconduct and the victim's family or whatever the case may ultimately be. We need to have a discussion about that and force a broader discussion of who is the employer of the police who does whatever they do wrong. And I got a good feeling you will find some people who reshape their thinking about the role of the police force in our communities. Because we're not being policed, we're being occupied.
Right.
That's real.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
You gotta help her. Be nice to her.
Thank you so much.
You better be nice to her.
Thank you, Gail Tyree, for your testimony. And now we'll welcome Mr. Brad Watkins. He's from the Mid-South Peace and Justice Center, and he will give us comments regarding homelessness and renters' rights, among other things. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. My name is Brad Watkins. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-South Peace and Justice Center, a 36-year-old organization founded on the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, because our founders wisely and correctly understood that as this was the city where Dr. King was murdered, this gives all of us a special responsibility to that legacy and to that work. At the center, we organize around two basic pillars. One, organizing with those most directly affected by the issue, because the only way you can have a solution if those who are directly affected not only have what we have in Memphis, input, which is kind of this word they use, but actual leadership and direction from those most directly affected. So homelessness, I often joke, is this industry that has billions of dollars and lots of people with advanced degrees, but it's the only business you can be in where it matters more to you what people who don't use your service think of you as opposed to the people who do. There is no sense of quality control. There's no sense of these people being clients. Instead, we have this kind of backwards mentality of good enough, and deciding and conditioning to a population of people to stand in line and jump through hoops for essential services, and being leveled out what is good enough from people who have never had that experience and therefore aren't qualified to be in a position to address a situation they have never lived through or experienced beyond the abstract. Moving quickly, to understand the situation of homelessness in Memphis, I would say imagine an upside down pyramid. And that bottom point of that pyramid is what we, through media and television, think of as homelessness. We're thinking of literally people sleeping on the streets. And we have a large population of people in Memphis who suffer under that. The city will often quote the HUD statistic, but we have to understand that that is just the people that were found on one day, a particularly cold day in January. And it's asking them the simple question of, where did you sleep last night? So if last night was the night that you managed to scrounge up enough money to get a motel room, you are not counted as experiencing homelessness. If you were in the hospital or in the jail for the heinous crime of sleeping or going to the bathroom, or all these other crimes that people experiencing homelessness get prosecuted for, you are not considered experiencing homelessness. Most people work, I would estimate, is probably about 7,000 people in the city of Memphis. And in a city with over 40,000 vacants, it's easy not to be found. So above the people at the bottom point, you have a much larger group of the population of people, most of them on fixed income, who are living in these largely unregulated rooming houses and our pay shelters. Because understand, we do not have free shelter for men experiencing homelessness in the city of Memphis. We have less than 60 beds, emergency beds for women experiencing homelessness. There's no place for a married couple to be together. There's no place for a woman with a male son past a certain age. And we have none of them since they are all faith-based, they can bypass the Americans with Disability Act, and none of them are fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Further, you have a great number of emergency shelters that do not take people under the age of 21. So you have a great influx of young people who are exiting foster care who experience homelessness, and their shelter options are even more limited. So when on top of, so then you have the people who are staying in the rooming houses, and the rooming houses understand exactly if you're on SSI or disability, how much you make a month, and they know to charge you just as much to squeeze you dry. So if you go to a place like Manor House, which is a house of hospitality in the Catholic worker tradition here in Memphis, you're going to see a lot more people at the end of the month than you are at the beginning. And that's the other thing people don't understand. 40% of people experiencing homelessness are working full-time. Right. We have people experiencing homelessness right now who are going to college. A good colleague of mine graduated from then Shelby State while experiencing homelessness herself. This is part of the reality of Memphis, because in Memphis we like to talk big about things, but we do not, our budgets do not reflect the priorities that our leaders say are our priorities. The city of Memphis contributes $0 to direct homeless services. Wow. There is a popular lie that the mayor's office, and it is a lie, where they list different programs that are funded. Those are federal programs through federal dollars that flow through city government to array of nonprofit organizations. So so in this case, you have no direct accountability between the service providers and the clients. You have a city that is not doing proper oversight. We have shelters in this city where a practice goes on, which is referred to on the street as play to stay, where staff at a shelter, and I'm going to say it, and I don't care what they do, it's Living for Christ is what they call themselves, and under the guise of religious faith. Because if you want to work with people experiencing homelessness and you work for an organization that sounds faith-based, then no one questions your intentions, your motives, your operations, or what you do. But at this place, after speaking to multiple people who have been there, worked there, and have stayed there and been victims of what goes on there, sexual activity is exploited from women and men in exchange for a place to stay. Wow. And these people, and so when people say, why don't they come forward, time and time again, what these people have said with trembling hands and tears in their eyes is, but that's 300 beds. And when you say that's 300 beds, that's the city of Memphis talking. The city of Memphis is fully aware of this, but you're not going to have proper oversight into these shelters because, one, the myth of keeping these shelters and some of these service providers as saints allows the city to continue with its indifference. So again, the city of Memphis spends $0 on direct homeless services. They do contribute money to fund an organization they created to seek funds to fund homeless services. So yeah, it's logic. It's Memphis logic. So we're going to create the city of Memphis is going to, who is tasked with this, is going to create a nonprofit organization to raise funds to fund other nonprofit organizations to address homelessness. Now, understand our numbers in Memphis compared to Atlanta are surprisingly low. Our population of people experiencing chronic homelessness is low compared to Atlanta. However, the length of period of time that people experience homelessness in Memphis, and I say experiencing homelessness because they are not from the planet homeless, is that we experience homelessness like 5 to 6 times as long. So we have to look into why. So you have to look at the group on the next level up, which are people who are not technically experiencing homelessness by HUD's definition, but they're staying on their brother's couch. They've moved back in with their parents, and they're one argument away. They're one bad day away from experiencing homelessness themselves. And then above them, you have an even larger group of people who are teetering on the brink, who are deciding which bill they're paying this month, which bill we paying this week. Can we, and these are the people who pay all the late fees and the cutoff notices and the reactivation fees. There's a lot of money being generated by poor people. Poor people are in fact the greatest job creators that this economy has, because we're constantly paying people to regulate them, monitor them, police them, and exploit them. I mean, how many people would be unemployed if we eliminated homelessness? So when you look at that, you have to look at our economy and understand that everyone has been knocked down a level. And that's continuing to happen. And so you have to look at the situation of housing in Memphis to understand homelessness. So with housing, at one point in time in Memphis, and I say this with nothing but respect to the faith community here and from outside of here, is that at one time, if a person who didn't have a lot of prospects wanted to raise themselves on the social ladder, then the way to do that was to become a pastor. Then you started a church, and now I'm Pastor Watkins. I am a person, I've moved up on, well, what we've moved on since then is now then it became when I started a nonprofit. So we have 1 billion one-man, one-woman show nonprofits, and the best ones get the least funding, and the ones that get all the money don't do much anything. And so then we moved ahead, and then it became about, if I want to raise my economic status and my prestige, I'm going to become a landlord. Because being a landlord in Memphis is like one of those jobs anyone thinks they can do. It's like being a comedian or owning a restaurant. Everybody thinks they can do that. And so what you had is people who got a bunch of houses and property that never should have been on the market in the first place. We have a code enforcement office that has less than 40 code officers for the entire city of Memphis. So I know a code officer, a friend of mine whose borders, and this might not mean much to some of you, but goes from Danny Thomas to Chelsea, from Chelsea to Hollywood, and from Hollywood to Summer North Parkway. That's the entire area that this one person has to monitor. She could spend a month in one block of Klondike, Smoky City, trying to hold these slumlords accountable. And the slumlords know it. They know no one is looking and no one is coming for them. And when someone does come for them, they know the reality. And the reality is that if code enforcement and the health department actually went zero tolerance and actually went by the regulations, you would have mass homelessness in the city of Memphis. Because we have neither affordable nor adequate housing. Now, how did we get there? You have to look at the foreclosure crisis, which happened in Memphis, started in Memphis in 2000. Memphis is the frontier of bad policy and ideas. They usually start here and get perfected here. We are the petri dish of bad policy. So when you had that, the subprime loans were nothing new here, and the effects of them were nothing new. We have entire neighborhoods that have been massively hollowed out through the foreclosure crisis, and when you look at those on maps, they cut directly along racial lines to the point that it stops at certain streets and areas. So when you look at what happened, now I'm moving from the pyramid to the jungle. Okay, so I'm big on the extended metaphors. So the housing market in Memphis was the wildebeest. The banks through subprime loans and the securitization of mortgages where no one really owns your house anymore. I mean, that's the absurdity of what happened. No one can prove they own your house, but they can foreclose on you. So you had, they killed the housing market in Memphis. But when the lion was done eating and moved on, there was still a carcass there. And that's where the jackals and hyenas came in. And those jackals and hyenas were the contractors for the city of Memphis who are stripping these houses, setting the fires, and then, because it was a fire, the contracts are no bid. And now those contracts can easily be awarded to the same people. If you pull a list of the contractors from 2007 to 2011 in the city of Memphis who had board-ups, demolitions, you will see contracts where the garage had one contract to get torn down and the house had another. One half of the duplex got torn down, there's a contract for the other half. And you have no one to ensure that this work is done. So if you get $1,000 a pop to cut some vacant lots, and it's June, who's to say you cut it or not? Because there's only 38 code officers. I think there's less than that right now in the city of Memphis. So when you looked at what the banks did, they left a carcass on the ground. They got their money through the securitization of mortgages and moved on. When the contractors came in and started stripping these houses, burning them, that sped up the contracting process. And further, there was collusion because at one time, only 2 people in Memphis decided what got torn down. In a system that was largely not based around computers, but in hard copies that were entered in by one person. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how someone can make a lot of money deciding what gets torn down. So then you also have our redevelopment, which built on the backs of taking seniors in houses that were always condemned and no one cared before. I'm going to condemn your house, and if you and now you have to pay the city $20,000 to get it torn down, or you can sign it over to the city of Memphis and you won't owe anything. And that's how we got Brewster Elementary. That's how we got the land for Brewster Elementary. That's how we get the land for a lot of projects. Because when the wrong people live there, we find a way to get rid of them. So getting back to that wildebeest, now you have other people who were in leadership of code at the time who figured something out. And this was something we stumbled across. We were working with people over in the Rosdale-Ansdale neighborhood to try to form a tenant association, or rather help them beef up their tenant association. They ran across a house that was an eyesore in the community. I thought, good, okay, we can work on this together and build a relationship. We looked into the details of the house and found that the house was owned by Miss Brenda Sebring. Now, it's okay for me to say her name because this story works out for her. And she lived on Mud Island. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. The city loves these neighborhood cleanup junk, even though we pay taxes for people to do it for us. But what we're going to do is we're going to cut the grass, we're going to bag it all up, we're going to go out to her house at Mud Island, and we're going to dump it on the front yard, and we're going to say, this is not vandalism, this is your property that we are returning to you. Now, I'm glad, now I always caution younger activists to look at something a second time before you do it, and I'm glad we did, because I looked a little deeper and found out she had declared bankruptcy, that she no longer owned that house. Right. So when we pulled the bankruptcy court records and then matched that with the city and county records of property ownership, something very interesting happened. All the houses in Germantown, in East Memphis, in Midtown, in Central Gardens, the banks took them back when she declared bankruptcy. These are our houses. The houses in Orange Mound, Frazier, Klondike, Smoky City, Boxtown, the banks left them there to rot. And so no one admitted to owning these houses. And that's what's called the shadow inventory. And there are tens of thousands of houses in Memphis that fall into that. So when you have a system where no one admits to owning anything, you have a system where the banks have been allowed to exploit Memphis by getting a second bailout. They got the federal bailout, and then our tax dollars bail out the same. So I wanted to stop there because I know you had some questions, but you asked me to follow Gail Tyree, and you asked me to talk about renters' rights and homelessness in Memphis. That's a lot. That's a long topic.
Well, thank you, and
it's short answer. It's bad here.
yes. Well, it was, your testimony was eye-opening in telling us the depths of the tentacles, and we appreciate that. How much time?
We'll have a brief time for Q&A, 10 minutes at the most, please.
Okay, so if commissioners can quickly get to ask some questions. I tried to paraphrase some of your things because they were so tweetable, but we have been constantly reminded here that there is a Good Samaritan industry here, and I have a whole thing about the Good Samaritan that people forget about what the real story was there. But you reminded us once again that we've structured a Good Samaritan industry, and there are big problems with that.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I want to ask a question about the resources that you said zero money has been allocated from the municipality to address homelessness. It's been a pass-through. Are you aware that the Housing and Urban Development federally has something called Section 3 that requires that any community, and every city, including Memphis, gets hundreds of millions of dollars from HUD annually. Every city is required to hire and then offer training to neighborhoods, communities that receive HUD dollars. So if a community-based organization has gotten block grant money, community development block grant funds, or neighborhood opportunity funds from HUD money, Section 3 in HUD regulations require that people who live in the area, who may be residing in a homeless shelter, that's receiving HUD money, that they be offered jobs and also be offered training. That's been on the books for 45 years, unenforced in most cities. So I'm letting you know that because it's an unknown little secret that you don't have to fight for it. It's already there in the books, in the regs, and that's available. And most cities claim they're doing something for the homeless when they send out proposals getting these hundreds of millions of dollars in HUD dollars, and you can hold their feet to the fire and hold every elected official accountable, city council members and the mayor, because and some of them have the nerve to be saving money, not allocating it all to that's why it's called housing and urban development. You're supposed to develop communities, not save it for a rainy day. It's raining.
I totally agree with you. The challenge here in Memphis with Section 3, and people have worked with that before, is getting HUD to vindicate those. So dealing with HUD in Memphis is like dealing with Polonius from Hamlet. They tell you and they affirm all these rights to you, and then the same conversation they say, but we're not going to do anything about it. And so we have actually shown where a local nonprofit, Door of Hope, was misusing HUD funds. I'll say it, they were misusing HUD funds. There was a stack of documentation. They were former employees, and I left a meeting with HUD, and they said, well, it's not against the law to break a contract. And that's what they went on, because the mentality at HUD is that it's just pots of money. I totally agree with you with Section 3. They should have done that with the demolition of Foot Homes, and there were a lot of people who, with the Vance Avenue Collaborative, who were pushing for just that. But unvindicated regulations are just words on paper here in Memphis.
Wow. There is a government agency that's the watchdog.
The OIG?
Yeah.
They weren't interested.
Put it in writing, get an attorney.
It did, and that's the challenge with a lot of the people we work with as far as needing an attorney to vindicate their rights. I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, the regulations are exactly that, but the application and the execution here is incredibly divergent.
Thank you. Hey, Brad.
Hey.
How are you?
Doing good.
So you always come with so many facts and numbers, and that's something that I definitely appreciate. And one thing that stood out to me this afternoon that you shared was the city says we have about 2,000 homeless, give or take, right? Accurate number is more likely 7,000 if we think about what homelessness really is, right? But we have 40,000 vacant properties, you said?
At least.
In the city. And so
give or take what the fires get rid of.
What, 40,
Give or take what the fires get rid of each year.
Give or take what the fires give up. How many of that 40,000 would you say are livable?
Oh, at this point, at one time, yes, but at this point, not very many. At one time when we were looking into the shadow inventory properties, we were like, well, look, I'm just going to change the locks and move in because no one's admitting now in this house. But the problem is getting to them. One, a lot of these houses were made on the cheap, so they weren't built to last. And two, they have just been left to rot. Most of them are not livable. Most of the properties that end up in the land bank aren't livable. And the other problem is, real quickly, is that we hardwired in our system create blight. So the city is never going to take your property for unpaid taxes. If any of you out there own houses and you pay property taxes, thank you, you're a good citizen, but the city's never going to take it. The county will begrudgingly, after 4 years, if enough people in the right neighborhood complain, do it. But the problem is that we in Tennessee have a right of redemption in foreclosure, which means you have 2 years to be able to come back and reclaim your home. The problem is that as a matter of course, when at closing, one of the documents you sign is signing away your right of redemption. The banks, however, keep theirs. So the problem is that even when people purchase a property through the land bank or acquire one of these properties, you still got to wait out the right of redemption, because otherwise you're just investing money into a property that the bank can come back and get from you. So we have a system that creates blight and maintains blight.
So is there a way to use these vacancies to lessen this number at all? I'm hearing not really.
I think there are some ways. I think that there's even simpler ways. The one, we have to tackle and dismantle the myth of the evils of public housing. Because what we now have are these site-based Section 8 apartment complexes that are basically worse conditions than our public housing had, and it's just privatized. We also need to increase the value of the Section 8 housing choice vouchers and fight the bigotry that says that people on Section 8 are ruining your neighborhood. That was a lie that was put out in the Atlantic Journal from Dr. Phyllis Betts, who worked with the University of Memphis at an agency called Cabana, and it made the false correlation between crime and violence in the community and people on Section 8, when in fact Section 8's two different programs that handle different populations in different ways, and more to the point, it's racist and a lie. And even further to the point is that 90% of the people on the Section 8 vouchers are seniors, women with children, and people on disabilities who are disproportionately, overwhelmingly the victims of crime, not the perpetrators. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of solutions with the vacants. I think the repurposing of some of our schools could be converted into single-room occupancy, but that's what we really need. We have a lack of single-person occupancy units for the value of the voucher, and we don't have enough properties that could pass the HUD inspection to be approved for the voucher.
May I ask a question? Given the complexities that you've been speaking to, and given what clearly are a number of improprieties at the very least, has there been consideration about outside pro bono support that could come in and support a formal lawsuit that could be offered in this regard? I mean, I'm thinking particularly of groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, not the NAACP, but the Legal Defense Fund, for example, that's done amazing work over the years, Thurgood Marshall and all the rest. Have those options been pursued to really present the case that you're presenting to us today in a systematic way to have a more systematic approach to justice here?
It would have to come from the outside, because the city of Memphis, like a bad partner in a divorce, basically contracts with all the top law firms in town, and no one's gonna, there are a few crusaders, but they're not gonna stick their neck out and ruin their career doing it. I think the other part of that is it's a miracle that Memphis hasn't been sued, because every year the city of Memphis, to your point, has to sign a document affirming our support of fair housing. The mayor and the director of housing and community development signed this, a legal document. With an Etch-a-Sketch, a child could prove that we have reconcentrated poverty. We have moved people, low-income people of color, from low-income neighborhoods of color to low-income neighborhoods of color. We don't have a single site-based Section 8 apartment complex in a neighborhood that is not low-income or majority black. Period. We do not. That is a geographic, spatial fact. We don't. So Memphis is a city that has gotten by for so long on violating these regs. We have gotten by so long for letting these landlords run rampant. We've gotten by that I don't think the leadership has any idea of wrapping their head around what to do about it. What we see is we need a rental registry ordinance, one that identifies these landlords, most of whom are not even in the country, and some accountability here, but also we need more code officers, and we need to bring back the reserve code officer program, where tenants could become licensed badge carrying code officers who can cite, and then we can begin to organize tenant associations, which we don't have a real strong history here, organizing people around that to fight against the inevitable retaliation that'll happen. We're also going to need a change of over in the environmental court as well, and we're going to need some changes over in our city government.
Thank you very much, and that helped a lot to put on record, because we know that housing is key to access to jobs, to schooling, to everything. Health, and it's key to mobility, and fault lines in the housing market are key for the record.
And this is a directory that we put out of homeless services that exist in Memphis, and I just wanted to leave that with each of you. But thank y'all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Brad Watkins. We would just like to be able to work through our break this afternoon. We have 3 more individuals willing to give testimony, and we do want to wrap up on time. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Susan Nelson, who is the Church Health Chief Medical Officer, to give remarks regarding poverty in medicine. And please, if you do need to step out or use the restroom or something like that, please do so quietly. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you for inviting me here. I'm humbled to be in this group. So we'll change gears a little bit, although what Mr. Watkins had to say, geography and housing affect health so tremendously, and that's part of the things that I have to say as well. Sterling McNeil, who also works with me at Church Health, this is something I'll refer to later. It's called the Model for Healthy Living, and the point of it is that health is not just about the pills you take, right? So just so, I don't know if any of you know me, but I'm a family doctor. I've been in Memphis for 24 years. I grew up in San Antonio, where I learned to speak Spanish, which has become extremely valuable, taking care of our immigrant patients at Church Health. And 2 years ago, 2015, I guess that's almost 3 years, I came to work for Church Health as their medical director. And before that, I worked with Common Table Health Alliance. Some of you know Renee Frazier. In fact, I think it's her fault that I'm sitting here today. And we worked together on healthcare disparities and improving quality in primary care practices. And Renee taught me a lot about that, and I will talk more about that in a few minutes. So also, as a side note, since 2008, I've been traveling to Haiti twice a year to work at a school for handicapped children in Port-au-Prince. So imagine my surprise when I looked up your logo, right, which is Neg Mawon is the name, that's the Creole name for that statue in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And it's a liberated slave, right, and it's a powerful symbol of Haitian independence. So I felt like I had that connection with you all as well. So, as I said, I work at Church Health. Dr. Jeremiah Wright, I believe one of your founders, was a speaker at our Faith Health Symposium about 8 years ago. So we are all connected, even if we don't know each other's faces. So looking up the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference, I read in your mission statement that you all are founded to empower and engage African American communities of faith to work as social advocacy agents, working with and on behalf of the vulnerable and marginalized. And that appeals to me because Church Health was founded by Dr. Scott Morris, who's a family physician and a Methodist minister. And he founded Church Health on the principle that it's the church's job to take care of the poor. The gospel message from Jesus is to take care of the poor. It's on every page of the New Testament. So in 1987, Dr. Morris opened a clinic at the corner of Peabody and Bellevue, and the first day they saw 12 patients. Last year, in 2017, we saw 15,351 patients. That was a total of over 46,000 clinical visits, and that includes medical, dental, eye, behavioral health, and physical therapy. And the secret sauce at Church Health is our volunteers. And those are doctors, nurses, front desk greeters, people who fill out Christmas cards for our donors. In 2017, we had 19,289 volunteer hours. So that's our secret. So as Church Health has grown over the last 30 years, we've not only added more doctors and nurses and dentists, we've added physical therapists, we've added behavioral health counselors, we've added health and nutrition educators and social workers, because helping people become healthy is not about the pills they take, right? Dr. Morris likes to say health is not the absence of disease. And over the years, we've learned that so much of health is about joy in living, about loving and being loved by the people around you, and drawing closer to God. And the doctor can't do all that for you. Guess what, right? We have to get people healthy. And our patients work in Memphis as musicians, artists, they're child care workers, they're housekeepers, they're teaching assistants, they're security guards, restaurant workers, landscapers, barbers. These are the folks who make Memphis work as a city and keep us all going. So in the model for healthy living, basically, I don't know if you can see it from where you sit, but basically it's a 7-section pie chart, and only one piece of it is medical. And other parts of it are your family and friends, your ability to move, to be physically active. Your faith life is a huge, important part of that, your emotional well-being. And the church has an enormous role in this, right? I think that's really the theme of what I want to say, is that the church and community organizations can impact health greatly, even more than doctors sometimes. And our patients have taught us about where the gaps are in healthcare. It doesn't do any good for a patient to have a prescription if they can't afford it. And if you tell somebody, come back and get your diabetes checked, but they don't have a car or can't get a bus ride, then that doesn't do any good. And it's not that they're non-compliant, right? We don't like that word at Church Health. So as I mentioned, Common Table Health Alliance is an organization I worked with, and they had a report in 2011 which had some pretty startling statistics. So the population of Memphis is 60% African American compared to 12% nationally. Our Latino population in 2011 was 5%. I suspect it's more now. But if you're African American in Memphis, Tennessee, you are 3 times more likely to have your leg amputated from diabetes than a white patient. Okay, African American, Memphis, Tennessee, 3 times more likely to have your leg amputated from diabetes than the white patients. The African American Medicare population, mostly our seniors, they visit their doctor less often than the white patients. Okay, mammogram screening rates are less in African American patients. Vaccination rates are less. Breast cancer deaths are higher in African American women than in white women. We did our own study at Church Health, and we did a 5-year chart review. So we looked back at all the patients we had diagnosed with breast cancer in that 5 years. There were 36 of them. 9 of them did not get the care that was recommended, basically because they refused it. These were all African American women. They had access to treatment and to specialists at no cost to them because of grants that we have from Susan G. Komen and the Tennessee Breast and Cervical Cancer Coalition. But they decided not to be treated, and it was extremely painful to read back through those charts because you could see the conversations that were documented by the doctors. You know, please, Mrs. Jones, can I make you an appointment? Or please, Mrs. Brown, and it was very painful to see that, but to hear see the doctors trying to explain to the women that they might be cured. Certainly they would live longer with treatment, but all these 9 women declined. Mm-hmm. And this is where the church can help, right? I mean, to support women through their treatment, which is scary, right? To help them find the courage to go through it, help them support their families. I mean, this is where community of faith, I think, comes in. So in 2009, Methodist North Hospital, in cooperation with the Common Table, did a study to look at healthcare disparities, and they looked at heart disease care based on race, ethnicity, and language. So African American patients with heart failure admitted to the hospital were 15 years younger than white patients with heart failure. African American patients with heart attacks were 9 years younger than white patients with heart attacks. So, you know, statistics are pretty scary. So Church Health has a walk-in clinic that we're open Monday through Friday for anyone without health insurance who needs to see the doctor that same day. And I want to tell you a couple of stories about patients. So Mr. Gonzalez, he's a 36-year-old patient with rectal cancer. He's a landscaper. He came to us about a year ago with rectal bleeding. He's unusually young to have rectal cancer, but that's what we found. And through our volunteer network, we sent him to West Clinic, and he received chemotherapy and radiation therapy and got much better. But he came to see me last week, and he was very discouraged because his last CAT scan showed that he has lymph nodes in his pelvis, and so he's going to have to go through chemotherapy again. And he came to talk to me about how he doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to need more treatment. He doesn't really even believe the new CAT scan results. He's alone in Memphis because his family's all in Mexico. He has no one to pay his rent when he can't work. He told me that he's gone for days without food and had no heat in the house. And he had just started back to working again when he got this new CAT scan result. So you could see why he doesn't want to go through treatment. So I asked our social worker to see him, and she's getting him some help through MIFA for food and to help with rent for a little while. And I managed to call his cancer doctor at West Clinic and find out more details about what he needed. And I called the patient back, and we had a long heart-to-heart, and he's decided to proceed with the treatment. And he thanked me, and he basically said thank you to Church Health for caring about me, because at least he has one person, right, that he knows is looking out for him. Church Health we have a lot of immigrant patients. Some of them have their legal papers and some don't. 40% of our new patients are Hispanic. Many of these folks work in housekeeping and childcare, landscaping and contracting work as painters, carpenters, and other manual labor. If they get injured on the job, if they break a leg or hurt their back, they have no workman's comp to pay for their care. If they live in a house with no heat, like Mr. Watkins was saying, or that's full of rats or mold, they're afraid to complain because the immigration agents can come and take them away to jail. And parents can be taken away from their children, who are then placed in custody. We've read about this recently in Memphis. So here's another story. Miss Paula is 52 years old. She's African American, and she had a rash. And her rash kept getting worse. And she went to the emergency room. She went to urgent care. She had seen 3 doctors before coming to our walk-in clinic. And we sent her to a volunteer dermatologist who diagnosed her with an unusual skin condition called pemphigus vulgaris. And pemphigus causes giant second-degree blistering burns, basically, over her entire chest and arms. And it was a little tricky to diagnose, but we got the diagnosis, and it required a very expensive treatment, which is basically like a chemotherapy, but we were able to get that through our network, and she's cured. And she's back to work as a secretary, and she's a good example of our typical Church Health patient who works but doesn't have insurance. And going to the emergency room does not help, right? You can't always solve every health problem by going to urgent care. And she needed an advocate, I think, to get her in to see a specialist and then help her get this expensive treatment she needed to get better, and she could not have navigated that on her own. We have thousands of patients like her who are 40, late 40s, early 50s. They're too young for Medicare. They don't have insurance through their employer, and yet they have serious illnesses that can't really be treated in an emergency room, like diabetes, high blood pressure, depression, other conditions. So one last patient story. Ms. Brenda is a 48-year-old office worker who came to Church Health with an ulcer on her leg for 40 years. I'm still speechless when I think of that. She told me that she had fallen and injured her leg as a child, and the wound never healed. And she's been walking around with this wound on her leg her entire life. She never had health insurance, so she could never get it taken care of. Because, you know, if you go to the emergency room, they give you an antibiotic and send you out, and it's dead, right? So we arranged for her to have a skin biopsy, and here's where the story gets worse. She actually had skin cancer in this ulcer. I'd never seen anything like it in 30 years of being a doctor. So we scheduled her with a surgeon who removed the entire ulcer and did a skin graft, and she's cured. She's fine. She's back to work. And now she comes to see me for regular checkups, which is great. So in closing, I'd like to say that our system in this country to help the poor is based on eligibility and compliance policies and procedures with dehumanizing labels for people, what Dr. Marcella Wilson calls the culture of poverty. It's driven by economics and unequal systems of health, housing, education, and employment. This has created a class of people who are falsely perceived as lacking strength and abilities simply because they're poor. The message is that people in poverty are the problem and require fixing, rather than fixing the systems which keep putting people in poverty and keeping them there. Poor patients have to choose between food and medicine. They struggle to get to their doctor's appointments, and they have no dependable transportation. People are told they just need to get a job, or to get a better job, or make better choices. Finding pathways for people to get out of poverty, these pathways do not exist. Regardless of age, race, religion, or culture, when individuals are exposed to poverty, statistically speaking, they will be sicker, less productive, more costly, and die younger than their counterparts. Understanding poverty as an environmentally based, treatable condition stops the blame and shame game, because poverty is not about who you are. It's about where you live and the conditions you're exposed to. No matter who you are, when you must constantly deal with food insecurity, racism, inadequate housing, poorly performing schools, high crime rates, and lack of access to a living wage job or transportation or health care, you will not only be less healthy, but you will die younger. This group of environmental conditions is also referred to as the social determinants of health. I'm sure y'all have heard that term. This is where the church can impact health. The problem is poverty, not the poor. So I think the call to action for churches is this. In Memphis, we have resources to help people find their way out of poverty. First of all, Church Health has a congregational health promoter program to train lay people in your congregation to be health advocates for your community. And Sterling McNeil is with me today, and hopefully, with your permission, he's got about 2 minutes of information about that. We have mental health first aid classes that we offer for the community, that we will come to your congregation and offer that, to learn how to recognize and deal with the mental health issues faced by many people in our community, and to be able to help someone in crisis get to the right resources. We have nutrition toolkits for congregations to help develop healthier eating habits and learn about how nutrition impacts health. And of course, we have many volunteer opportunities at Church Health, of course, to get involved with all these things I've said. We're partnering with United Way in the Transitions to Success program. This identifies people in poverty and helps them advocate for the services that they qualify for and often unable to access. And I hope Ken Robinson, who's your next speaker, will talk a little bit about that. Finally, I do want to thank you for the great privilege you've given me by inviting me here today. I'm honored to be here with people who are trying to advocate for the poor and the marginalized. I think when we stop blaming the poor for being poor and start breaking down the systems that perpetuate poverty, then we'll bring true change to our communities.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you. I work in faith community outreach at Church Health, and we work with all faith communities in the area to help them develop ministries where they can help their people. We are a health organization, and we go beyond just the physical health of the person to the total health of the person, for the total man, as you can see in the model for healthy living. And the congregational health promoter class that Dr. Nelson mentioned helps the people and show them, the members of the congregation, how they can go and coordinate events and programs to help bring good information, factual information, and resources back to their congregations, and not only their congregations, but those in their community, so they can help them to live a healthier life, totally and completely. And this is a class that we've been doing since 1988 for the last 30 years. And it has been free, and we are not just training them and throwing them out to just go ahead and work on their own, but we are there as a resource for them. We develop a relationship with them so that we can walk with them and even hear their needs that they have in their communities and see how we can help fulfill that, either through trainings or bringing in educational speakers or whatever it may be. But we work with them, with our staff. And so that's an important program that we have, the Congregational Health Promoter Class. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
I just have a quick question. Thank you both. And Dr. Nelson, this is for you. First, I just wanted to share that often one of the statistics that you shared talked about that screening and visitation rates are lower for people of color. And when you're talking, we're sharing the story about the generational feelings behind healthcare, especially in the Black community, after years of medical genocide and malpractice against Black people. Yes, and that gets passed down, yes, and not even verbally, just from the practice of parents not seeing them go to the doctor or seeing the mistrust they might have of doctors. And so I know that's one thing we have to work to break on both sides, is that doctors understanding and having compassion for the years of medical trauma that we faced as a community as well. But my question for you today, Dr. Nelson, is you talked a lot about healthcare advocacy at your level and the patients learning to advocate for themselves. Does Church Health engage in any advocacy with local and state government around some of the policies that drive some of these factors? For example, when screening and visitation rates are lower, do you all take the opportunity to go to the city government and say, you know, hey, we've got to do something about MATA so that our people can get to the office and those type of things? Do you have that type of programming?
So we do not. Now, and Dr. Morris, who was not able to be here today, he told me, because I asked him somewhat, not in that same language, but basically the same idea. How do we advocate for people to get these services? And his opinion is that the people who deliver the services cannot always be the people who advocate for the services. It's kind of two different skill sets, if you will. We do advocate in some way because we bring what we do to the attention of the community and we encourage donors and all of that. But there's something, and he is much smarter about that than I am, but apparently there's reasons why perhaps he's tried that and it didn't work so well. And I think honestly, Church Health model is, you know, we don't take government funds except through Medicare and Medicaid we do, but 90% of our patients are uninsured. And so how do we sustain that? Well, we have a huge network of volunteers and we have a lot of donors. And sometimes donors, and I think you guys will understand this, right? Sometimes donors, I don't even know if I can articulate it, but if we are pushing to change the system that puts people in this situation, sometimes the donor, do you hear what I'm saying? I have to be careful. I can say this in this room, okay?
Yeah, we understand.
Right? So there's that challenge of continuing to deliver our services, which require support from our donors. That, you know, there's that political thing we have to play as well. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Smith.
So mine is a follow-up question to your response. You mentioned that you were founded by the United Methodists in some way, shape, or form. So did I understand that correctly?
By Methodist minister,
By
Dr.
Methodist
Scott
minister?
Morris, yes.
Okay. So my question is, to what extent is that relationship still true with the Methodist Church or churches? And if there is, I work with United Methodists and other Methodists on Capitol Hill who do the kind of advocacy that is needed to change policies and to speak to some of the issues we're speaking to today. My question is, if there is a relationship or a potential relationship there, are there ways to deepen those kinds of possibilities relative to the systems? My second question has to do with primary care. I heard several of your stories really dealing more with more chronic and really the deeper levels of giving health care. Maybe I heard you wrong, but I'd be interested in knowing more about how you relate to this model at the primary care level. And are you working with colleges or universities and volunteers and others to help make sure that circle has the kind of substance that's needed for what you're projecting as your model for healthy living? And if so, how does that collaboration work? I mean, not a deep piece, but just a brief overview of how that may work for you, given the work that you do at the health facility.
So let me see if I can rephrase your question. So regarding advocacy with churches, one thing that's very important to us at Church Health is that we work with communities of all faiths, okay? We have it's not just the Methodist Church, right? We work with Temple Israel, we work with, all kinds of communities of faith across Memphis, and that's very important to us to be.
I'm sorry,
Right.
you misunderstood my question. My question had to do with the genesis of the organization being
Right.
founded. Do you have
Right.
organic relationships institutionally to the work that you do, not that you work
Not
with
really,
multi-faith
just
environment?
other than what I said. So that was, I didn't answer it directly, but that's what I was trying. There's not really a formal relationship with the United Methodist Church that I know of. Now, my senior director sitting behind me, and she's probably pulling her eyebrows out because I'm not answering these questions. You know, I'm here to answer the doctor and the health questions and maybe not the administrative questions. But So if you see somebody bouncing in her chair back there, yeah, that's who that is.
Okay.
So primary care, I'm glad you brought that up. Diabetes and hypertension are two areas that we have focused on really intensely in the last couple of years, really trying to bring quality improvement to those areas because, of course, heart disease kills 1 out of 2 Americans. Hypertension, diabetes are a huge problem in Shelby County. We have 12% of our population, Shelby County, has diabetes, where it's, I think, 9% nationally. So, huge problem. So, at Church Health, what we do, this is why we have health educators. Right? It's not just, I mean, I can sit with you, if you're diabetic and I'm the doctor, I can sit with you for 20 minutes and try to go on and on about why you should take this medicine, and it just doesn't really connect, right? Health educators are much better able to say, here's how you read a label, here's how you make good food choices, here's how you might think about exercising. It doesn't mean join a gym. You know, just trying to be more organic, as you said, the word that you used, to help people identify what will work in their life. Because I think the lesson of Church Health and of people that do primary care well is all my knowledge that I give to you it's got to be two-way. The patient has to be engaged in their treatment plan and their health plan. They have to want to get better. You know, so approaching all of that is very important to us. So most of what we do is primary care. I guess I mentioned those extreme cases because they're the ones that really stick out in your memory about somebody who has been struggling with something for a long time and now is cured. That just feels good as a doctor, you know.
Thank you.
So,
Dr. Nelson, I have a follow-up question, please, really quickly. And I appreciate sharing about the work that Church Health is doing and the impact it's had on the community. I was struck by the story of the woman who had this ulcer for 40 years. And rather than the fact that she had the ulcer for 40 years, but more so what prevented her from getting help for 40 years. So thinking about, kind of similar to what Tammy was talking about, the history behind seeking services. And I feel, I'm Nigerian, and so a common African proverb is if you teach someone, right, the teaching to fish versus giving someone fish. And so the fear, or you know, the fact that someone walks around for 40 years with an ulcer has me question what we're doing in the health community to change that, because I think we can continue to put Band-Aids on the problem and not address the underlying problem around racial injustice and how medical providers, all of us, treat people when they walk into a hospital, and the impact of racism in a hospital, and data after data that shows black children wait in waiting rooms, emergency rooms, longer than white children. Data that shows that even when people of color go to the doctor, the service provided is not the same, right? For mental health, for physical health, that racism itself is part of poor health, outside of the other factors that contribute to that, but racism itself. And when you look around and the providers around you are not people of color, and what that means, that you as a person of color is walk into a room where none of the providers look like you. So where do we start to address those things? Because otherwise we keep giving people fish and not teaching people how to fish.
So I agree with what you said. I mean, your premise that racism affects healthcare, I'm ashamed of that, but it's true. I mean, that's a true statement. And what Tammy Sawyer said about the fear that is in some of the African American community, I mean, I can understand that, right? And part of my maturing, if you will, as a provider has been to try to understand that, and not just with people of color, but learning that the patient brings something to the table. So, you know, when we're put through medical school, we are given this a lot of knowledge, but there's the message to the students is You have all the knowledge, and it is your job to fix this person. And if they don't get better, it can't be your fault, it must be their fault. You see, I mean, it's this weird mentality that we're trained, and I've been trying to grow out of that for a long time. Because guess what? Studies show if the patients are engaged and they understand and they buy into this whole treatment plan, well, then they're much more likely to do what you say, right? So at any rate, that's part of my own learning and my own journey. At Church Health, we have a family medicine residency, which we started 2 years ago. And we are recruiting and training family doctors. And we just had yesterday we had 1,200 applications for 4 positions. So, yes, it's quite incredible. So we got down, I think we interviewed maybe 80 people, and now we're ranking about 40 people. Yeah, so that's how the system goes. So we are very intentional. If someone is of color, if someone has a different background, maybe ran their family business, not the typical graduate college 22, go to medical school, just a little bit different life experience. If they speak Spanish, they get bonus points. I mean, people from different faith backgrounds, because we very much want to have the providers look like our community, right? But it is a struggle, because you have to start with the 3rd grade education, right? We need decent public education, because by the time somebody gets to college, if they haven't learned to read, you all know this, right? So it's one thing, we're kind of on the far end, right? It's not too late, but it's almost too late to start recruiting doctors of color, because that starts when they're, 9, when they're 5. So I don't say that as an excuse. I'm just saying that's I think what part of the thing y'all are working on is advocating for better public education. But anyway, thank you for sharing that, because you are right. It's kind of the elephant in the room, if you will, that there's this history with the African American community about trusting the providers, and also the racism that's in the room. And I think the first way to solve a problem is at least shine light on it. So, yeah. So, yes, sir.
Yes, I'm a preacher. My brother is a doctor. We exchange ideas because he understands that I call myself a specialist in moral and spiritual and behavioral issues. He's an expert in clinical. And we find that there's a natural synergy between us when we consult. Yes. Is there any evidence that kind of understanding is developing in schools of public health, in medical schools, as to relate preachers and moral educators with those who do the clinical work? Is there any evidence of that? And secondly, in regards to the woman who has to have chemo again and almost giving up, if she were related to people in Gina's church who were just standing by as a part of a cultivated group, who would walk with this woman when you make the decision, instead of simply to the social worker, a member of a congregation who say, well, look, call on this group, she'll walk with you through your clinical, if you got to go chemo, so that in addition to their natural fears, they'll at least be comforted that they have a companion navigating those systems. So both of those. In the industry, is there any awareness that, preachers and medical people probably ought to have greater relationships, conversations with each other? They probably are natural allies. And whether we can make better use of volunteers to help people who are otherwise reticent to even take the advice that a doctor might give.
So I think, of course, it's interesting because Dr. Morris is a Methodist minister, and some medical schools are more aware of that than others. My daughter is sitting in the audience. She's a third-year medical student at UT, so I don't know if she has an opinion. I don't want to put her on the spot, but I think that there's the role of the doctor as scientist, right? And that I think became the ideal. And of course, it's great. We have wonderful advances in science and technology. But I think that what a little bit was lost was the relationship and the spiritual part of that connection between doctor and patient. And Dr. Morris is all about this, right? And this is what we're trying to reemphasize at Church Health there is a spiritual connection. And we do have connections with congregations. We always need more volunteers. We do have a volunteer group for women with breast cancer that we try to connect people to. But I appreciate you offering and telling me again the idea. If we can try to connect someone with, do they have a community of faith? That's always helpful. Sometimes they don't. So, and this is a young man actually, and Spanish is his primary language, so that, presents another barrier, if you will. But this is what we're all trying to be cognizant of at Church Health, is that it's not just the pills you take. There's a spiritual aspect to your health, and how can we help you find that, discover that, call on that, when you need strength to face something.
And for this reason, we celebrate the work of Dr. Scott Morris and the Church Health Center. And we thank you, Dr. Nelson, for your testimony and for your witness.
Thank you. We'd now like to welcome Reverend Dr. Kenneth Robinson, who is the President and CEO of the United Way Mid-South.
Thank you and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The commissioners and some of you I know very, very well. I'm Kenneth Robinson. I'm a preacher and a physician.
Yes.
And I appreciated the robust dialogue you were just having with the representatives of the Church Health Center. I chaired their board for about 8 years. I'm here today to talk about generational poverty and social services. I'm currently the president and CEO of United Way of the Mid-South. I do have prepared remarks, and I hope that I will have some time to share in similar dialogue and answer some questions. The Commissioner is clearly concerned about the interrelatedness between poverty and health. The questions that preceded me were on point in terms of the integrated nature of the determinants that impact health. I'm a person who knows some of this from personal experience, Dr. Forbes. The community I served as pastor for almost 25 years here in South Memphis, down the street from Commissioner Stewart's church. The babies who died before the age of 1, whom I sought to save. The disproportionately impacted unhealthy population that I targeted for enhanced funding and public health services when I was Commissioner of Health for the state of Tennessee. The food deserts, the paucity of available and accessible high-quality early childhood education, the preponderance of substandard housing in the urban core, and the underlying entrenched poverty. Their faces and those places are faces and places of color, especially here in Memphis. If you were to do GIS mapping and overlay the GIS maps of each of those determinants and elements, you'd see the same map, particularly here in Memphis. The statistics look suspiciously similar in all of those arenas and all of those domains. The black to white relative risk ratio, 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, 3 to 1. It's the same in either of those domains. And the years keep rolling along. Clearly, there is a connection between poverty and health. There's actually an interrelatedness between poverty and health, poverty and education, poverty and place, place and health. Using the adjective that Dr. King taught America very well, they are all inextricably interrelated. The interrelatedness of socioeconomic factors, the multi-headed dragon, as Elizabeth Babcock, the president and CEO of Economic Mobility Partners, a Boston-based group that ensures economic mobility for people of color living in poverty. This multifactorial nature of adverse consequences and poor outcomes, the fact that it is now, for you as commissioners and for us in a dialogue like this, a moot issue to continue to debate cause and effect, precursor or byproduct, chicken or egg, this is the functional reality facing persons living in generational poverty. The remedy is to address everything, whether sequentially or simultaneously, but certainly systematically. Indeed, the predominant face of poverty in Memphis is a person of color, primarily African American. Although our Latino community is growing. In the city of Memphis, 26.9% of the residents live in poverty, as I'm certain you have heard today, the highest in the nation among MSAs that have populations greater than 1 million. Child poverty rate is 44.7%, the highest child poverty rate in the nation. The poverty rates for blacks in the city of Memphis is 32.3%, while for non-Hispanic whites, 13.3%. You can do the math and see the relative risk ratio. Moreover, poverty rates for non-Hispanic whites are lower in Memphis and Shelby County than in Tennessee as a whole and in the United States in every age category. This intractable multi-generational poverty is supported and perpetuated by institutional racism at the foundation of every system of our civil society. Racism that limits access to opportunity for persons of color, whether it be quality educational options, accumulated financial assets, and or access to capital, or access to healthy housing, healthy nutrition. The problem is that when we work the way we normally work, when we work and operate and address issues in silos, siloed efforts to impact poverty like this intractable, this multi-generational, siloed efforts have had limited success because of the cumulative burden of factors such as low educational employment, low educational achievement, lack of penetration and preparation to enter the workforce, low financial literacy, and poor population health. Deaths from cancer, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes that are higher than anywhere in the state of Tennessee and in the United States. It's clear that we cannot continue to do the same things, not in this city, and expect a different result. I'm clear that awareness is key, that advocacy is required. Sometimes activism may be necessary, but action, different action, action beyond words, action beyond planning, action, collective action, collaborative action is absolutely critical in our society and certainly in the lives of low-income individuals and families. In order to achieve economic self-sufficiency, to overcome the burden of economic inequity and economic injustice, the plethora of obstacles and barriers that continue to face persons living in poverty, all of the social determinants of generational poverty must be addressed. All of them. In healthcare, in my other life as a systems thinking person and leader and administrator, we've embraced the concept of the accountable care organization and even the accountable care community. In accountable care organizations, they are now incentivized to provide the highest quality of care by forming a system of care which provides the right level of service at the right time, at the right access point to generate the best outcomes. Here in Memphis, the organization with which I'm currently working, and I'm currently leading the United Way of the Mid-South, is doing more than talk, and yet working at our point of strength. We are taking action. We are pioneering and launching such an accountable system of care. In this case, an integrated human services ecosystem, which is designed to address the needs of persons in poverty, holistically and comprehensively across multiple domains. So my testimony today for you is simply a fourfold premise that should apply. First, that poverty is a condition. It is a condition, often a downstream sequela of economic injustice. It is a condition that can be addressed. It most commonly is not and should never be broadly characterized as simply a confluence of personal fault, poor priority setting, and poor personal responsibility. That's blaming and shaming the victim. It is a condition that can be addressed. Second, individuals living in poverty do have aspirations. Contrary to some common notions of those in populations that do not know people that live in generational poverty, those persons who are living and struggling and surviving every day in generational poverty do have aspirations. They have dreams like everyone else. But because of the multitude of their socioeconomic challenges which they face, their aspirations are most commonly, most often, beyond their current circumstances. Third, individuals living in the context and under the consequences of economic injustice are indeed able and are willing to advance out of poverty over time if provided a specific path and a structured process to do so. Many people mistakenly believe that persons living in poverty no longer aspire to get out. That would be a mistaken notion. And finally, the fourth premise is simply that a structured, comprehensive, integrated system of care across multiple human services and quality of life domains can achieve that end. People can progress from crisis towards self-sufficiency. United Way of the Mid-South is driving the development of a more connected and integrated network of agencies to address poverty in the Mid-South by collaborating to holistically advance persons in poverty toward their dream of self-sufficiency. This network approach is what I call driving the dream. Driving the dream is creating, facilitating, and monitoring an accountable system of care, similar to what we see in healthcare. An accountable system of care comprised of agencies whose staff are trained in a client-centered model which utilizes a multi-domain assessment tool and is undergirded by a shared data platform. It has never been done before. This framework is a collaboration across a wide array of programs and services with the goal to improve the effectiveness of service delivery by seamlessly, intentionally, and efficiently moving individuals and their families out of crisis towards self-sufficiency and other goals which they, the clients, identify. Functionally and intentionally, the system of care is driving the dreams of individuals to facilitate their economic self-sufficiency. We're tackling economic injustice at the system level by facilitating and optimizing supportive services that seek to help persons of color in generational poverty see a pathway out of poverty and towards a life of their choosing, rather than only providing one-off, disjointed, reactive, and often paternalistic interventions that tend to perpetuate racial inequities and economic victimization. In summary, the work of driving the dream is to change the culture and the operations of current service-providing agencies and to build an integrated system of multiple human services and quality of life domains. Commissioners, the relevance of my testimony is even broader than Memphis. Driving the Dream addresses a common problem faced by many communities, agencies working in silos, not effectively addressing the multitude of problems facing persons that have lived in generational poverty. It's particularly relevant for large urban areas similar to Memphis that have both a large population of persons in poverty and a large and dispersed public and nonprofit human sector. We're building a robust and comprehensive system, and while driving the dream is relevant for the human services system, this model and the implementation and its learnings can be applied to many sectors, from juvenile justice, for returning citizens, to public health, and to the burgeoning focus on addressing social determinants of health. Thank you very much for your attention. Take any questions.
Dr. Smith.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for your intervention. It's well received, and we certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
So the United Way has a structured voice of public policy advocacy. As one who's worked with the United Way, particularly in Indianapolis, Indiana, I'm aware that that arm does exist.
Thank you.
And so it's not just about human services. It is also about changing systems with advocacy around real issues. So I'd like you to say a word more about that. I didn't hear a lot of that in your comments, just more about the human services dimension, but talk more about those structural advocacy points. Second, I heard you make mention of food deserts. At Bread for the World, of course, that's a priority issue for us on public policy issues. We work to try to end hunger and poverty with our partners as believers of faith. If you could say a word again about where that intersects with the issues of disparity of health in this community. And then finally, if you could just speak to the point about the intersectionality of food, nutrition, and health. We commissioned a major report just a year ago, our annual hunger report, that dealt with those kinds of intersectionalities. I'm interested to know what your thinking is relative to that as you think about this kind of network of care provision in the models that you're developing. Thank you.
Let me take it a little bit out of sequence. You're testing my old mind here. Certainly the relationship between food, nutrition, and health is clearly established. As I pastored in South Memphis, one of the priorities in addressing the social determinants of health there for us was to bring healthy, nutritious food into that community. 99% black, 85% living below the federal poverty level. We brought healthy nutrition through a farmer's market, which no one thought would survive in that community. It turns out to be one of the highest grossing farmers markets in the city. We followed up by establishing a small corner grocery store, a healthy grocery store that was not selling beer and cigarettes, with both Obama administration funding and local foundation support. Associated with that small grocer is a teaching kitchen, so that persons in our community who would eat better and would prepare food more healthfully if they knew how, could learn how to prepare the food more healthfully that they could buy at the farmer's market and a small grocer. The connection has been well established. It is certainly well established locally. Food deserts exist not only in urban core, but also in rural communities, and I know that the Proctor Conference is concerned with both urban and rural challenges. I think the previous federal administration had a very healthy understanding of the relationship between food, nutrition, and health, and very robust investments were made in trying to overcome the presence of food deserts. Again, if you took a GIS mapping, you'd see the same pattern, where the food deserts are, where the poor health outcomes are, where the poor economic associated elements are. Clear and indisputable connection. In terms of United Way's public policy, if you've seen one United Way out of the 1,300 in the nation, you've seen one United Way. It sounds as if your United Way was extraordinarily active in the public policy agenda. I am a person who certainly has been a pragmatist. All of my 35 years of professional life in medicine, public health, and in pastoral and community leadership. One of the things I'm clear is that if we don't work the system transform the system, revolutionize the system that we have, then we will be talking and marching and advocating for another decade. I'm too long and can't wait that long to start from scratch. So advocacy for me and activism for me is to start where I am planted with the strength that I have. For our United Way, the general approach to individuals that are living in crisis has been to simply fund. The historic approach was to fund social service agencies that were serving the individuals that are living in poverty. 84% of the time, a person who walks into a door of a United Way agency to access a service or a program that we fund, at least in part, 84% of the time in Memphis, that person is living at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. So by definition, United Way was serving people that were struggling with generational poverty. I've chosen to take my time as president and CEO there to create a system which again institutionally addresses not what individual agencies do. If they are funded at all by our United Way, they're doing extraordinary work with the simple single services that they provide. Rather, what they've never done is work together collaboratively, collectively, to build a system of warm handouts, of referrals, with an accountable backbone organization, which in this case is the United Way of the Mid-South, ensuring that persons who walk through any door in crisis at a level 1 on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, seeking services, social services that are our strong point here for this United Way in the Mid-South, that those individuals are not dropped, that they don't have to start over again when they need another service at another agency. And the good news is that by building this system of care, we are able to identify gaps within the human services agencies. Those gaps are then informing policies for which we will be advocating. 2 weeks ago, sat again for the 3rd time with the mayor of the city of Memphis, with his chief administrative officer, the Memphis Housing Authority and HCD and the Workforce Investment Network, and even the 211 program that simply historically took calls but never referred people into a system of services that could move them from one service to another agency that provides another service, and intentionally keep those individuals from just going around the same mountain every time they need service and every time they're in crisis. So for me, creating that system, which is absolutely prototypical, absolutely unprecedented, is the best way for me to advocate for what should have been done but has never been done before.
Dr. Robinson, I appreciate what you've outlined for us, and the question I'm going to raise with you really builds on that. So if you could share from the vantage point of a person engaging these services, an actual case in point of what they would experience.
Great example, a young lady comes into an agency looking for high quality child care. She's looking for child care for 3 dependent children. Someone in engaging in motivational interviewing, which requires us a sea change, a culture change at the point of access, at the point of contact for someone walking in the door of an agency. Generally, frontline people have never asked someone, what else might we do once we provide you with the service that you've now requested? So someone at that agency where the mom was looking for child care recognizes that the mother is also undereducated, unemployed, living in substandard housing. The value of having a system of care is that through that one door, that frontline person in that one agency, either in connection to another high-performing case management care coordinating agency, will be able to then direct that mother to the point that she, case in point, one of the young ladies who worked for me, who was a mother exactly like that, could then be pointed to finish her education, her bachelor's degree, go on and get a master's in education, could then be counseled so that she generated an appropriate household budget to become eligible for a mortgage and to buy a home that we built for low to moderate income families so that she could then find even better employment, since she was unemployed when she first came, hired her as an assistant at the child care center, then as an executive assistant, but with her additional education, she became a counselor in the school systems and now is a manager of accounts. So someone, some entity, some agency that is trained, which is what we are doing, training the agencies to appropriately interface with individuals who walk in a door, see what the panoply of services that might be needed to propel an individual from the crisis of just not having child care for her children to a point of extraordinary self-sufficiency. That story could be duplicated and replicated literally hundreds of thousands of times in Memphis were the system in place, and I'm bound and determined to create that system.
Dr. Robinson, I want to get at the advocacy from a different perspective because I'm
listening to the commissioner. She's giving me the
zero. I listened to her, so I'm shutting up. So we thank you so much for what you contributed. And
thank you.
And no, I mean seriously, because we have had the most wonderful people testify, and we have to respect everyone's time. And if we don't keep moving, we're disrespecting their willing to contribute.
I appreciate the time. Thank you very much for allowing me to come.
And certainly we can continue these conversations over our dinner break, so thank you very much. Ms. Shahida Johnson, we'd like to welcome you to give your testimony. Woo. And after Shahida, we'll have our closing remarks, so thank you.
Hello. I lost my folder, y'all. I'm so sorry. This has been a very interesting day, and I'm not really sure why I'm here. And so I've been thinking, what can I provide or what can I bring to this conversation? While also balancing some of what I've heard, some of which has been enlightening, some of which has been very triggering. I was asked to talk about marijuana decriminalization and economic equity. And economic equity for me at its core is really about equal access. It's about equal access in the social sphere. It's about equal access in the material sphere. It's about wealth. It's about access to education. And I think those things have been brought up over and over and over again. But I think the core of it for me is about worthiness. It's equal access to a clean slate. It's equal access to a second chance. It's equal access to a lack of judgment when you walk into a room. I say that on the backs of listening to the last two health providers or service providers, and I think about my life and my experience. When I was 22 years old, I was pregnant, and I gave birth to my daughter, my one and only. And during the childbirth process, I was given an epidural, and around 6 p.m., my daughter was hard-headed then, so mid-labor she decided she was tired. She fell asleep apparently, and it stopped all labor. And so I stopped dilating, and they pushed me into a room at what was then Methodist Central and said they would come back. 5 hours later, they came back and decided to give me a C-section with no additional anesthesia.
Wow.
I told them that I was in a lot of pain at that point, and my nurse rushed me and said, "Hey, you're not going to be numb from the waist down because you're going to have to push. It's going to be uncomfortable." And I said, "No, this is not uncomfortable, right? I know what pain is, and I am in pain." And so they rolled me into the room, shine a light in my face, and I remember the feel of a knife cutting me open. I say that and I share that story not to turn around, but to talk about how important it is that we give credit to people's experiences and people's whys. That when we think about service providers and we think about the fact that I've sat here and I've heard so many people give conversation and talk about how we need to educate them and how we need to make sure the young people know this and how we assist the poor do that. And the thing that I hardly ever hear, except from people who are on the front lines, is the voice that says, what are their whys? We have to stop assuming that poor people are stupid. We have to stop assuming that marginalized people are stupid. Because, and I say that we're assuming they're stupid because we always hear about education. You cannot educate somebody to come out of poverty with financial literacy if they're making $8 an hour. Right. So you can't educate me to be rich on $8 with rich dad, poor dad. You can't bring me to the table and talk to me about how to access these services if you're not empowering my voice. And I'm empowered because I heard today what I normally don't hear in this space, and so they don't normally let me in these spaces, y'all. And I cussed a lot, and I promised my mom I was not gonna cuss. She done text me 5 times. I did actually said I was not gonna say the F word, so I may say another cuss word, but y'all bear with me. And so one of the first things I learned when I started organizing was the fact that we got to take our capes off. We come into these rooms with our capes tied on trying to save everybody. These people we do not need saving. We save ourselves every day. We are living and breathing and working in the worst of circumstances, and we are surviving and thriving. What we need to be, what needs to happen is we need to be the center of this. Yeah. Our voices. If you trust black people, then you trust their experience. You can't just give a data point that says that, 42% are living in poverty, and then we're not going to talk about how we get to that poverty. We're not going to talk about the systemic issues that lead to that. We can't have a conversation about community resources and not talk about the fact that our tax dollars, which my sister said here earlier, that's our money. So it's not about divesting from tax dollars. It's about earning those dollars and telling them and putting them back in our communities and making sure that that's the number one priority. In addition to building up communities, it's not an either or. And so much of what we do is binary thinking. We are always thinking it's got to be either or versus both. And we do need support services, but we cannot have a nonprofit sector and talk about economic equity. We can't charge the nonprofit sector with fixing systemic racism. And the root of that is what all of the issue, where all of these issues stem. We're talking about education. We're talking about lack of education. We're talking about people need to be educated on voting. They don't need to be educated on voting. They don't voted and people done got in office and they did shit. But we don't want to talk about we don't want to talk about voter apathy in the same way. We want to charge them and hold them accountable. If every black person in Memphis voted for Trump, it wouldn't have changed the election. So let's not talk about this political connection, because people understand that they got out and voted for Willie Harrington. They got out and voted for A.C. Warden. And we got to understand we have a black city council. And a lot of folks still in poverty. So the apathy has nothing to do with the fact that they don't know. You don't have to know what the commissioner's supposed to do to understand that when they got in office, they didn't change your life. Right. That's not ignorance. That's not what that's so we gotta stop. We gotta take that. We gotta stop coming to the table all the time speaking for people. We're not bringing them in the room. Right? We're not bringing them in the room. We're talking for them. We've not asked them what they need. We've not asked them what they want. And we're not representing them. And a lot of times we're sitting in these academic spaces having these theological conversations, and is no grounding in the work on the ground. We haven't been back to the hood in 20 years. We haven't walked the halls of our schools. I had the biggest eye-opening experience. I graduated from Northside High School in 1996. At the time, we had metal detectors and police officers, armed police officers that walked our schools. I thought that was normal for everybody else. I just thought that's what happened in school, right? 20 years later, I walked back. It was the same. I'm not being facetious. The same computers that were there when I was there 20 years ago.
Wow.
The school had not changed at all. the lockers, the rooms. Nothing had changed there. Meanwhile, my daughter is at White Station. They got whiteboards and shit. You know what I'm saying? And we talking about equity and we talking about education. And we want to talk about the kids acting a fool. But they know and they understand when you care about them. They know you don't care about them in North Memphis if White Station got whiteboards and they ain't got chalkboards.
Right.
If they got school buses and they over here with $1 million booster clubs that can send their whole team to state, and you can't even get a band uniform over here.
Wow.
And then and I don't know, y'all. I don't know what else I'm supposed to be saying. I'm just passionate about the fact that I think a lot of this has to grow back to us really trusting what black people. Trusting that their experience is not a result of stupidity. It's not a result of lack of effort. It's not a result of lack of caring. We talk about what happens in the inner city, and we talk about, that you do it to yourself, you do it to the other person. Well, we pit them against each other. So if it's you or me, then it's gonna be me. So we ain't talking about that dynamic. We ain't talking about the dynamic that if there's, we heard earlier about the number of homeless people here and the number of beds available. So if it's you or me and it's 2,000 beds, I'm going to do what I got to get to that bed. And then we're going to talk about acting like animals, but then we ain't talking about the cages that we putting them in. And we do that over and over and over again. And we sit up on these ledges and we talk down and we talk about, well, what people need to do or what we need or this is what they should have done. They don't know no better. They know better because they are living a life that most of us couldn't walk a day in those shoes.
That's true.
Most of us don't know how to survive on $20 with $20 in your pocket for the week. And we doing it every day, and we are still, when we're talking about the labor movement, we're talking about why people don't understand the importance of labor unions. Well, part of that is because so many of us who understand, that's not who's feeding them information. They're not ignorant of the information. They're being fed a narrative by somebody else. So if we're not there talking to them about it, but where we are is on social media saying why you don't deserve $15 an hour because you work at McDonald's.
Right. Right.
We're the ones saying that, well, I support black business, but when I went in there, we ain't gonna talk about customer service. We're gonna talk about customer service. We're gonna set the bar of excellence so high for black people. We said it's so high that it's almost impossible to compare. Yet we don't talk about the lack of resources. I was a trainer. When I first started my career, one of the first things I learned is that there are 5 things that you can't out-train. So we always, if you work in training, everything comes down to you. But you cannot out-train. You cannot train bad business practices. You can't train out bad policy. You can't train out apathy and lack of resources and lack of skill. And so that's the same thing when it comes to education. You cannot educate people out of poverty. You cannot educate people out of lack of resources. You cannot educate people out of apathy because no one has shown care. Those things, those are not educational issues. Now we have educational issues, right? We have educational issues that talk about the fact that we have stats that nobody can ask me, you can read on a 3rd grade level, but if you pass in 3rd grade, how can you pass 3rd grade and not read on a 3rd grade level? Right. Where's the level set? Who's setting the level? If we're talking about the fact that you can get A's and B's here, and then there's a state test, nobody knows what the matrix is for the test, where it comes from, you're just handing it down. But that's the standard that we're judging our children on. This is the standard that we're judging our teachers on. And then you tell the students who have been in school making A's, now you got to bring them in the classroom and say, hey, you made an A, but you can't read. And then we wonder why they fall out. And it doesn't make any sense to me. And it seems like I do feel like a certain part of this is the fact that we don't want to acknowledge and we don't want to stand firm and fight for what we know we need and what's necessary. And that is equal access to resources. That is equal access to the right to start over again. Marijuana decriminalization is just part of this because the bottom line is it's a trigger into, it's a pathway into the school to prison pipeline. Right. And mass incarceration. That's right. We see that marijuana is one of the most cited offenses, right? We have not seen a reduction in crime, though, so there's no connection to crime and people. There is a connection to mass incarceration and the war on drugs. There is a connection to the way the profit industry from prisons. There is a connection to bail and money that profits off nonviolent offenses, and why would you even be paying bail? It doesn't keep you safe, because you got enough money, you can get out of jail. Right? It's just another way all of that is just another way to penalize and criminalize poor people. That's all I got to say, y'all.
So first,
Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. First, Shay, let me say how much of a gift it is to be out on the front lines with you and to hear you speak with so much passion. Thank you for reminding me I ain't the only prophet that cuss in public. I do, and right where you were ending is actually where I would like for you to lean in a little bit more, because I know some of the organizations that you've been involved with have done some wonderful work around bail reform, and we know that that is a contributor to the economic inequities and mass incarceration. So can you talk some more about personally what you, the official Black Lives Matter Memphis chapter, and some of the other organizations you're connected with have done with regards to bail reform and how that helps with economic inequity?
Well, so one of the biggest initiatives that we're pushing for official Black Lives Matter is, like you said, bail reform. And one of the reasons why is that we have found, especially in Memphis, but in a lot of urban cities, that the city is basically using bail as a money-making entity. So there are so many people that are being targeted, so over-policing, broken windows policing. You get stopped for, small minor traffic citations, then you catch a weed charge because you might smell like dope, you might have some on you, and then, so then you go to jail, right? And then you have to bail yourself out, and then you have to go to jail. But a lot of these offenses are either thrown out later on, right? You don't get the money back if you bail out, by the way. So bail bondsmen is a whole other industry that's like, okay, it's gonna be $1,000, give me $100, we call it good. But you don't get that $100 back. And then in Memphis, where so many of us are living check to check, what we see is that one of these offenses where you might have to come up with $500 or your family comes up with $500 can literally be the difference between you being homeless today. Yes. Right? So there's a direct connection to poverty in Memphis. And then in addition to that, it is also directly related to over-sentencing, because when people have one or two charges and we don't have the support of public defenders, we see that they're more likely to take a plea charge to get out of jail, which then we are seeing longer sentencing, which is another effect, right? So now we're talking about mass incarcerations, and the slavery doesn't necessarily go away, just changes, right? So we went from plantations to mass incarceration to prison camp labor, and now we're mass incarceration. And so now we're taking mass incarceration and just sending them home with the ankle on their bracelet for 7 to 10 years, right? So we're doing this over and over again. So what we're trying to do is advocate for bail abolition, and that is just, we really want to do away with it altogether, but some people, when you start talking about getting rid of shit, people get all scared. So the first step is to get rid of, is an advocation or trying to get policy passed for the removal of bail for non-violent and misdemeanor offenses. And so that's the first step, and that's one of the things we're organizing around. You should see a lot of movement around that. We're doing another bailout. So we did a Mother's Day bailout in May, where we bailed out 7 women and found out how horrible the system is to navigate, because we also had homeless women who were experiencing homelessness that we bailed out. We could not place them. So we could not find support services. One of them had mental health issues, which I have not mentioned here. We don't have no support. So there was no support for that. We literally had to pay out of pocket and figured it out. And Trisha ultimately ended up back in jail as a result of the fact that there are no support services available, or very few, and none that could take her immediately at that time. And so that's some of the work that we're working on here with the official Black Lives Matter chapter.
I want to thank you for your testimony. Yes. I represent a national organization that's been fighting for reparations for decades. And one of the things that you need to know is that we were so moved by the beginning of your testimony, because you may not know, but you touched on something that happened during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. There's a wonderful book called Should America Pay? Edited by Ray Wimbush. I wrote a chapter in that book, but that book has in a chapter written by somebody else that documents how the OBGYN profession in the United States got started by practicing on African women and cutting them open and beginning the C-section process on who were given no anesthetics, no painkiller, nothing. Cutting them, carving them up like they were animals. And this went on, so that whole element of medicine was created by the victimization, the deliberate dehumanization of African women. And as you talked about what happened to you, absolute a pain went through my womb, I'm telling you. So we understand. And it is not something that you deserved or that should have happened. It was an absolute tie-in to the transatlantic slave trade. And what needs to happen? We need to own responsibility for demanding reparations. Guess who got reparations? The people that lost the Civil War, the Confederates. They got reparations. Homestead Act, white men got land.
Right.
They got everybody has gotten, except Africans.
Right, it's true.
The significance of your demand, the so-called generational poverty, it's generational white supremacy in this country.
Right.
That's the issue. Wealth, 70% of the wealth in America is inherited.
Right.
Where did you inherit it from?
Right.
Yes, exactly. It's inherited. So, well, the cause that you have been carrying, I want you to know is connected to your ancestors. To those who loved you, who prayed for you, who resisted terrorism for you. So I'm going to talk to you after this meeting. So you make because we need you in the reparation movement.
Thank you.
Shay, I want to say thank you for your testimony. I think it touched everybody up here.
Yes.
I wanted you to talk a little bit about mass incarceration in Tennessee and how it works, and if the prisoners are forced to work while they're in there, or what we're doing, what you're doing in Tennessee once they have been released to get their voting rights back.
So that's a whole other that's a whole other issue. So the voting right issue, I mean, that is that's a I'm gonna set that over here. So the way mass incarceration works is and again, I by no means an expert, so this is not my expertise. I just happen to have been to jail a couple of times and in my past. I did graduate though. I had graduated from college too a couple of times. I say that to also say that there's a reason why I also didn't get up here and run my resume. And I feel like I'm tired of having to prove myself in spaces, in rooms. And that you should trust that I'm in this room with you because I have a similar expertise in something, and that should go for whether I'm in the room with, whether I'm the only black face in the room or wherever. But when it comes to mass incarceration, I do believe that there is right to work. You get time off your sentences, you get time on your books. There are lots of benefits to the mass incarceration that comes with free labor, pretty much free labor. There's the cost, they charge you for everything. So there's the cost for pay cards to talk locally, like that's a real thing. And so what we're trying to do is to take bits and pieces of the prison industrial complex and break it down. So bail was the easiest. It's also one of the things that's gaining traction around the United States because, again, when we start talking about an abolishment of a prison system and breaking it apart, people get real shaky. So what we're hoping to do is to walk a path that ultimately Black Lives Matter is an abolitionist organization. So we do believe that we can govern and police our own. And so the first part of that is bail reform. The second, we're also looking at sentencing and doing work around sentencing. We're working with Law for Black Lives to think about how do we reduce sentencing to use locally use the judge system because judges can set bail and bond and have a direct say-so in sentencing. So seeing if we can work by advocating for teaching lawyers and judges how to advocate for us, putting judges in positions, the same, making sure that we're as diligent about appointed judgeships as we are about appointed council positions, to make sure that we have advocates and people that are fighting for this all around. So kind of wraparound services concept that you hear nonprofits talk about in the judicial system.
What about the role of the DA?
You trying to make me cuss. So I think the role of a DA is very important. I think our DA is trash. And I think that is one of the first things that we need to walk around. One of the first things that we need to talk about is one of the most important things is when it's time to replace, that we get that person out of there and put somebody in place that does more than play lip service and does not have a history of terrible policy, of racism and misconduct as our DA.
Shay, really quickly, because we got the wrap it up sign going, but first, always thank you. And when I first met you, you challenged me, and it's a point that you made about when you first sat down, you said, I don't know why I'm here. And then when you just ended, when you got cocky, you said, I ain't got to run my pedigree for y'all. And that's the point right there. And we're both black women, and we both share similar struggles. I grew up in an upper middle class home, and you always made me question why people chose me. Why does Tammy Sawyer get to speak in front of the room? Why does Shay doesn't? Why does Miss Stewart not get called, but Tammy Sawyer does? Why does Official Black Lives Matter not get a call, but you do? And I thank you for always challenging that, because my experiences aren't necessarily your experiences. I'm not naturally from the same communities and streets and neighborhoods that you are. And I think that oftentimes we were earlier called by Dr. Harris, the black intelligista, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we sit around and we solve problems and we have our degrees and we have our work, and we forget sometimes to go to the source and not just to solve problems for people, but to bring them back to the table. So I thank you, even though we share our blackness and we share our womenness, for always challenging me to go to the source and give that same power that people give me, give power to people's voices who don't have the same economic advantages that I had. So thank you.
And I do want to say, as I said about Kedron, I am just honored and privileged to walk with you, march with you, stand with you, and to be with you out in those streets. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for all that you do.
And in closing, we say we know why you're in the room, and we are glad that you're in the room.
Amen. Thank you, Shahida. Thank you so much for your testimony. So now I will invite the General Secretary of Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference to offer a few words before our closing remarks.
Well, it's been a mighty, mighty powerful day. We praise God for the blessing. I want to acknowledge the logo that has already been spoken to. It is the logo that represents the Haitian Maroon, the unknown soldier, the warrior. It represents the way in which the Haitian Maroons called the assembly for those who would stand up and speak truth to power and to fight for liberation. And so it's the call of the conch shell that we lift up in Joel to call a sacred assembly. We began saying that we're standing on sacred and holy ground. And so we have called the assembly. And then the sword is a representation of the word of God. And so we have heard from the bellies, from the wounds of our people, the voices and the experiences, which have given a rise to our remembrance of what it means to believe that to speak truth will set you free. And so we are saying to ourselves as a community of African people that we are being set free by this truth-telling exercise. We're saying to America that America's soul will be set free if it dares to walk in that truth. And so we also have chosen the work of a young artist. If you look there of the children and the eyes looking through a tattered American flag, the name of that painting is "Oh Say, Can You See?" So as the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference moves forward with these truth-telling commissions around the nation, we are saying to America And we're saying to ourselves, oh, say, can you see? So take that with you. And know that as an organization that is certified as a United Nations non-governmental organization, this process is a process that will inform and participate in the decade, the International Decade of People of African Descent, which has been declared by the United Nations. And so we will make available this full transcript, the video of this proceeding. It will become a part of an international report. And we thank you for all that you have done by just being present. We thank the commissioners for having listening ears and open eyes. We thank the testifiers who had the courage to come and speak. And now it gives me great pleasure and honor to ask our co-chair of the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference, the Reverend Dr. Freddie Douglass Haynes III of Friendship West Baptist Church, Dallas, Texas, to join us with closing remarks.
As always, our visionary General Secretary has basically said all that needs to be said, so we look forward to you joining us this evening at 7 p.m. For our town hall. Indeed, we are saying to America, we refuse to buy the lie, and since we refuse to buy the lie, the truth will indeed set us free. Thank you to all of you for your participation. Thank you to our outstanding commissioners, and thank you to those of you who boldly dared to tell the truth. May we live in that truth, for that truth indeed is our source of liberation and power. Peace.
Will you be staying to the evening? Oh, yeah, I am. Okay, all right, very good. It's been